Chapter 334. Lionel's casual greeting reached all of their ears. At that moment, everyone's attention shot toward the same teenage boy. Despite the fact he looked as though he had just crawled out from a garbage dump, he held a certain undeniable valiant air that made him too difficult to ignore. Lionel yawned again. This sort of scene. Why did it feel so familiar? Beneath their gazes, Lionel flipped his palm and allowed numerous snow globes to appear. Afterward, members of the Aderna family began to appear one after another, plopping to the ground as Lionel released them. Big brother Lionel. Nana was the first to recover as she wasn't harmed to begin with. While the others were still in a daze, Nana seemed to realize that Lionel must have been the one that saved them. Lionel smiled lightly, patting the little girl's head. Seeing her childish excitement, he could tell just how much the Camelot Zone had weighed on her mind. The second of the Aderna family to come to was their oldest, and the man that had been responsible for their lives. However, it seemed that he had failed in his task as a guardian fairly badly. And to make matters worse, his mind was still foggy. He found it difficult to tell whether or not they were still within a zone. This elder's name was Mattias. He couldn't help but look toward Lionel with a hint of confusion. Lionel only smiled. I hope your Aderna family remembers this favor. Mattias blinked in confusion. Favor? Wait. He looked around and seemed to recognize the island they were on. They had escaped? How? Mattias had been absolutely certain that they would all be dead. All right, bye. Lionel waved and seemed set to leave, causing many to be shocked. Catra's gaze sharpened. Did this boy really not take them seriously? Lionel. The roar cut through the heavy rain and rumbling clouds. Even Lionel couldn't help but look back only to see an infuriated Badger. In fact, the latter's skin had reddened to the point that it seemed to steam beneath the rain. Lionel frowned slightly. It wasn't only him, but Hutch as well. It had to be remembered that Mayfly and Badger were sent by Hutch in order to save Lionel and the others of the island. It could be said that Badger was thus a person of Hutch's. No matter how you looked at it, him standing out now would only muddy the situation. Do you have something to say to me? Lionel shifted his gaze toward Badger. How could he not tell why the latter was enraged? However, what did Mayfly's death have to do with him? If he should be blaming anyone, it should be Monet for failing to protect her own. And even if he didn't want to blame Monet, he should then blame the Aderna family for screwing everything up to begin with. This was a unique zone. Deaths were practically inevitable. If the plan doesn't had entered, it was likely that the death count would have been the same if not worse. Badger fumed beneath Lionel's nonchalance, but he soon calmed, his gaze becoming a smothering volcano that was ready to erupt at any time. Large wings spread from his back. It seemed like he might shoot forward at any moment, ready to risk his life to take Lionel's. Lionel shook his head and couldn't be bothered. He didn't want to stir up any more problems. Before he left Earth, he still wanted to destroy the Royal Blue Fort. If these issues blew up instead, he would have to head to Terrain first and deal with it later. This was obviously something he didn't want to do. Lionel was still worried about his teammates. There was no telling if the junior Governor Duke had chosen to target his friends in his absence. In normal times, Lionel would trust James to protect them, but the event of that month taught him that James truly couldn't be counted upon. When it came down to it, James placed the matters of his family above friendship and camaraderie. If Lionel thought about it, there wasn't anything necessarily wrong with this approach. If he was asked to choose between his father and his friends, wouldn't the choice be obvious? Of course, if others heard Lionel's thoughts, they would think him too cold or calculating. How could one so easily make such a choice? But to Lionel, it was just this simple. However, it seemed that Lionel wouldn't be getting his wish. Unauthorized entry into a zone, hoarding of contraband, and the murder of a fellow soldier. Lionel's crimes were calmly listed by a familiar feminine voice. He didn't even need to look to know that the person in question was Monet. Lionel's gaze swept through the crowd to land on the red-armored middle-aged beauty. At this point, Lionel didn't even bother. He took out a talisman. Since he wasn't going to be able to leave here peacefully to do what he needed to do, he would just leave to Terrain now. However, he would remember this. He was certain that by the time he came back, these Supremes wouldn't be able to handle him even if they banded together as one. By then no one could stop him from doing what he needed to do. The expression of those watching changed. Of all the things they expected, for Lionel to say not a word and truly prepare to leave caught them completely off guard. Lionel, wait. Lionel paused. There was only one person he would even bother to listen to at this point, and that was obviously Hutch. Though Lionel was a bit unsatisfied with the way the old man had kidnapped him against his will, delaying his plans to raise the royal blue fort to the ground, he still felt that the retired supreme was a net positive on his life. The old man sighed. Just stay, will you? With me here, who would dare do anything to you? If you want, in a few years, I'll even give my supreme position to you. I'll see who dares to say anything. Hearing these words, others were stunned while Lionel just smiled. I appreciate the sentiment, old man. But I think it's best that the Slayer Legion and I part ways from here on. Hutch shook his head. They're a bit shameless, but it's still not good to be alone in this new world order. You's like you need an umbrella to grow beneath. Lionel grinned. Shameless is a good word for it. The people I just saved the lives of are now accusing me of crimes. I wonder how many of them would be alive without me. Monet's expression turned ice cold, red flames flickering within the depths of her pupils. But Lionel continued unperturbed. And I dunno. Something about that umbrella term makes me itch all over. With a last smile, Lionel activated the talisman. I'll be seeing you, old man. Chapter 335. Everyone watched as Lionel vanished. In truth, it wasn't that they didn't consider the idea of Lionel using one of his rewards for a chance to escape. It was just that none of them had expected him to leave without practically saying a word. Had it not been for Hutch trying to get him to stay, he would have probably spared them all just a single glance and left. It was pure disdain. He couldn't even bother to try and defend himself regardless of whether or not he was in the right. He felt no obligation toward them. Yet somehow his gaze was burned into all their minds. He never said the words "I'll remember this" aloud, yet they somehow felt as though it was echoing in their ears again and again. Hutch sighed and shook his head. Seems that Brad is finally slowly awakening to his true self. Lionel's final words constantly reverberated in his mind. Something about that umbrella makes me itch all over. Suddenly, Hutch began to laugh. He looked no different from a madman in the midst of the rain. But no one dared to take a madman holding a machete lightly. Catrice's expression flickered numerous times before it settled into a sneer. I'll be sure to report all of this back without missing a single detail, Hutch. Not only did you bring such a scourge into the Slayer Legion, you didn't even care that one of the geniuses under your charge died due to his actions. At that moment, Hutch seemed to remember something. Suddenly, his vision sharpened. Catrice's hair stood on end. He immediately shot backward, his nerves tense. In that instant, the world seemed to slow. No matter how hard Catrice tried to move, he couldn't seem to accelerate. It was as though he had been slowed to slow motion, or that the world around him had suddenly been fast-forwarded. Blood spurted as a limb twirled into the air. The crimson was quickly washed away by the endless barrage of rain, but even then, it was just as quickly replaced by a new flow. Catrice paled, looking down at his right arm which now lay on the ground. Since you didn't make the choice, I decided to make the choice for you. Hutch said casually. His indifferent voice made everyone freeze. His complete nonchalance in the face of blood and gore made them feel as though he wouldn't lose a wink of sleep even if he killed them all one by one. Consider this a simple reminder that you can't just speak to anyone as you please. Hutch continued. And as for the death of Mayfly, you seem to forget that I raised her practically as my own daughter. The indifference in Hutch's voice soon became coldness. His gaze swept over, landing on Monet. In that instant, Monet felt as though she had been thrown into an icy hell. Her knees uncontrollably buckled, causing her to almost fall to the ground. All the lofty demeanor she had, even when she was facing the demons of Camelot, came crumbling down with a single look. I would really like to know what her superior officer was doing as Mayfly died. You all seem to want to focus on the fact that Lionel wasn't meant to enter, when the truth was that Lionel was originally on the list of entries. The one who wasn't was Monet, who self-inserted. Isn't that right? Monet shivered. This was true. Originally, Badger and Mayfly were meant to enter as one. They were so used to partnering with one another that the sum of their teamwork was far beyond themselves individually. To say that they could surpass a Supreme when working together wasn't an exaggeration at all. This was the New World Order after all. Being older didn't necessarily mean you were stronger since Earth was still in its infancy. Monet grit her teeth and squeezed out all her strength to speak. Lionel injured Badger before their entry. There was no choice. Oh, Hutch laughed as though he was amused that Monet dared to speak back. And why would he hurt Badger? Hadn't they just worked together to escape the beast tide on the Project Hunt Island? I wonder what made them enemies in such a short time. Hutch's questions seemed light, but they all put more and more pressure on Monet. The latter felt as though her heart might stop completely if she was pressured any more. At that moment, the situation suddenly changed. Hutch's gaze narrowed as he looked off into the distance. An older man with a head of white, flowing hair approached with a pair of massive white wings. He looked no different from a deity descending upon the mortal world. Whether it was his demeanor or looks, he seemed impeccable. Even the winds and rain bent around him. That's enough, Hutch. Hutch looked up but didn't say much of anything. He only sheathed his blade and began to walk away with broad steps. The angelic man frowned toward the disregard. I hope you understand, Hutch, that among the retired Supreme, you aren't the only one who's awakened a variant ability. If you make an enemy of us all. At that moment, the angelic man found the world around him slowing. His eyes widened, a blinding golden light emitting from his body. But before he could react, Hutch had already appeared in the skies, snatching a handful of white feathers and landing heavily on the ground. I wonder, how many more do you think I need to pluck off before you can't fly above me anymore? The angelic man suddenly seethed in rage. But remembering Hutch's ability, he also felt his heart go cold. Why did such a madman have to awaken such an ability? In the end, the angelic man remained silent, watching as Hutch walked away. Though Hutch seemed slow, he had already left the range of the island in the blink of an eye, gliding over the black, raging waters. At the moment Hutch was gaining some interest for Lionel. The latter had found himself in a completely unexpected situation. Unlike Aina, Lionel was teleported to a proper place. There was a well-elevated platform located in the middle of a bustling city. In fact, Lionel's initial appearance didn't garner much attention until it did. Lionel hadn't even stepped off the platform, yet when a dozen armed guards charged forward, spears and swords in hand as they completely surrounded him. Lionel turned his gaze back to the first person he had seen after entering this place. She was a woman of average looks who gained a salary for manning and maintaining the order of the teleportation pad. In fact, Lionel and her had just had an amicable exchange. The dictionary had begun to work again, so Lionel only had to rely on it to communicate in this odd, new language. He didn't think there was a problem with doing so, as he had already noticed several translation treasures in the hands or on the bodies of others. But now, for whatever reason, that same woman who he had just been conversing with was avoiding his gaze. Lionel wanted nothing more than to find a hotel and take a nice long sleep. But now he was suddenly being threatened from all sides. Where was the justice? Chapter 336. Lionel was speechless. Just how bad was his luck? He hadn't even been on this world for all of 5 minutes, when he suddenly found himself in a heap of trouble once again. The worst part was, he didn't even know what he had done wrong. At that moment, there were shouts coming at him from all directions, but he couldn't understand anything they were saying. Though it was possible to use the dictionary to translate, that could obviously only be done one at a time. He had no idea what all the fuss was about. Lionel closed his eyes and shook his head, willing his fatigue away to deal with the current situation. Speak one at a time, please. I have no idea what you're saying. Lionel used the dictionary to translate these words, but the shouting didn't seem to stop. In fact, it intensified. It was obvious that these people knew Lionel was a foreigner, and this wasn't even an area where foreigners were rare, yet they kept speaking in their native tongue. It was hard to believe that they weren't doing it all on purpose. Lionel tried to speak with the lady that received him again, but she continued to avoid eye contact for reasons he was left completely in the dark of. He truly had no idea why he was being treated like this. By this point, a sizable crowd had been built. After all, this was a bustling city square to begin with, and was most definitely a hotspot for tourists. When they saw such good entertainment before them, how could they not take a pause for a look? As more and more people gathered, Lionel suddenly noticed a striking difference between himself and them. Everywhere he looked, no matter where it was, everyone was excellently dressed. Even the most modest amongst these people who kept their jewelry to a minimum and refrained from wearing elaborate dresses carved of expensive furs exuded the air of nobility. Lionel had always been an observant person. It wasn't a matter of his ability, but rather his social abilities. He realized that in a place like this, considering he was dressed from head to toe in rags, he stuck out like a sore thumb. Is it really because of my clothing? At this point, the shouting around Lionel seemed to come to a stop, which caused Lionel to stop observing his surroundings. A leader of sorts stepped forward and spoke some words. Lionel sighed a breath of relief. Finally, we're getting somewhere. Lionel could tell that they had stopped their shouting tactic after realizing he wasn't very moved by it at all. He didn't know why these armored warriors wanted to intimidate him, but he could only slowly realize the truth from here on out. State your name, affiliation, and purpose. The dictionary translated for Lionel, finally allowing him to tell just what was going on. I need to learn this language as quickly as possible. Lionel didn't feel off-put by the question. Even on Earth alone, just traveling from province to province elicited questions just like this. It only made sense that it would be asked when it came to travel between worlds. My name is Lionel, I come from Earth. I'm only here on vacation. Lionel felt there was no need to speak about his purpose of finding Aina. Speaking truthfully would only raise more questions. In addition, he had no idea what Aina's current situation was, but he still hadn't forgotten that eerie feeling from before. If he wasn't just being paranoid and she really was in trouble, then mentioning the fact that he was looking for her would only put them both in danger. The spectators had much more sophisticated translation treasures than Lionel did, so they all understood his words practically immediately. But as a result, they were confused and gave Lionel weird looks. Earth. They had never heard of it. Though Earth was greatly valued by higher dimensional worlds, information about it wasn't quite widespread yet. These people might look rich, but compared to true nobles, they still had a long way to go. That said, the reason they were giving Lionel weird gazes wasn't because of this. There were too many worlds. How could they know all of them? That was impossible. What they found weird was the fact he said he was here to be a tourist, but if that was the case, why was he dressed like that? Lionel, however, was thinking about something completely different. He didn't miss the sharpening of the captain's gaze after he spoke of Earth. Just what was going on? Come with us for further questioning. The captain said coldly. Lionel frowned at these words, but the guards seemed to react immediately to his hesitation, placing their hands on their weapons. There's something weird about these guards. They don't seem to be dressed like natives of this land. Lionel separated out everyone he observed into 3 categories. There were natives, tourists, and these guards. Natives all seemed to wear garbs that crossed flexible armor with robes, giving them a distinctive look. These guards, however, had their own mode of dressing. Each of them wore fluttering robes, but they were split below their waist into 4 sections. One section to each of the sides of their hips and one to their front and back. This design exposed the metallic sheet armor that covered their legs. In addition to this, each of them had the same design on their lapels, a golden pin that held an oddly shaped star and cross. It seemed to exude a level of authority that garnered the respect of all those that looked at them. The more Lionel observed, the more he felt there was something off about this. He looked back toward the woman who had received him again, not surprised to find her still dodging his gaze. By now, he was certain that these men were called here by her. What a joke. To think they had just been having a friendly conversation, only to find out that she had been stirring up trouble for him. The young woman shivered. Compared to Lionel's previous inquisitive gaze, she could feel the coldness of this one. Her heart skipped several beats, losing its regularity. The change left her unable to breathe properly. Lionel looked away. I will follow you. He regained his calm, glancing toward the captain with an indifferent expression. The captain frowned but ultimately gave the signal to surround Lionel and escort him away. Chapter 337. The young woman watched Lionel's back disappear into the distance, her breathing still hitching. It was only after a long while that she gritted her teeth in rage. If it wasn't for the fact she was still in public, she would have likely found anything she could to throw and bash around. How dare he? How dare he? How dare he? The young lady ground her teeth in silence. What happened? Who was that guy? At that moment, a familiar voice to the young lady stepped forward. The young woman, looked up to find exactly who she expected to. It was another young woman of similar age and type. They both had decent looks and cute features. It was truly a case of like people attracting one another. From afar, they even looked quite like sisters even though they weren't. Sil. Ugh, I thought you said that this job would be easy? Sil giggled, rounding Rai's desk and hooking her arm around her friend's. You've already had this job for years. Now that you've soaked up all the benefits, you want to come back here and blame me? It seemed that Sil had quite the standing. If not, how could she have possibly helped regain such a position? Sil seemed quite amused by her friend's complaining and wanted to ask more, but the teleportation pad suddenly lit once again. Hid her dissatisfaction and politely greeted another client. After some pleasantries, she sent this person on their way and sat back down in a huff. Now can you tell me what happened? Pouted. With your connections you could easily find out. Why make me talk about something that makes me upset? What kind of friend are you? Sil giggled. Second and third hand information isn't as good as the real thing. Come on, don't hold out on me. Plus, you know that my family doesn't have much jurisdiction over them. When she said these words, Sil's playful expression became a tad bit more solemn. But, regardless, she still pressed for answers. Sighed and caved in. A couple months ago, they briefed all of us attendants on some new information. Apparently they're cracking down on fugitives and escapees. Whenever I see a sign of suspicious activity, I'm supposed to make small talk with the suspect and secretly call for reinforcements. But this bastard actually glared at me like that just because I was doing my job. Sil's eyes sparkled. A crackdown? Why? Who are they trying to catch? Who would be bold enough to become a fugitive in the eyes of those people? Clearly, to Sil, this wasn't a normal case. Let's just say that becoming a fugitive of a world, or even a network of worlds, wasn't as bad as becoming a fugitive in the eyes of these people. I don't know anything, I just followed their orders. Said with an exasperated sigh. Sil giggled. He only glared at you a bit. Is there a need to be so angry? Gave her own glare at these words. You don't get it. I thought I was going to die. A measly third-dimensional brat actually pressured me. How embarrassing. Sil blinked. He was in the third dimension, yet you still called them for him. Froze for a moment. Then she blushed profusely. It seemed she realized she had done something wrong. That was right. How could someone in the third dimension be who they were looking for? It was no wonder he glared at her. After a while, regained her bearing and bit her teeth. Even if she made a mistake, there was no need to treat her like that. What a bad guy. What good was being a bit handsome if you were so weak? Finally snorted. If I see him again, I'll definitely have sister-in-law teach him a lesson. Sil burst into a fit of giggles. This sister-in-law was referring to was actually her own sister-in-law. Sil had an elder brother who treated the both of them like his own little sisters. So despite the fact they weren't blood-related, still called her sister-in-law. Of course, there were deeper matters in relation to this oddity, but they were unimportant at this moment. It's really curious though. Sil said after a moment. Isn't it supposed to be a struggle for those in the third dimension to adjust to a fourth-dimensional world? Where did he get the strength to glare at you? Froze again, seemingly stumped once more. Sil giggled and shook her head. This friend of hers had always been a bit simple. If not for this, she would have helped her get a far more prestigious job than this. Though this gig paid well and was very stable and safe, it wasn't exactly the most esteemed. Young Mississippi, just when Sil wanted to speak with a bit more, a strict voice sounded from her back. To her back, there was an inconspicuous man with sparse hair. He was well dressed and groomed, while his hands were perpetually clasped behind his back. However, the way his hair fluttered about like the wings of a bird made it difficult for Sil to take him very seriously. That said, this was only because she knew that this old man would never harm her. For others, if they saw this old man, they would head in the opposite direction 99% of the time. The remaining percentage point was an unknown variable. After all, the dead couldn't testify. Already? Sil pouted. Yes, this is very important, young Mississippi. The city lord isn't willing to compromise on this. Sil sighed and shook her head. She knew that talking wouldn't do her any good. Fine. Let's go. I'll see you later, Ree. Okay. Ree waved her friend goodbye. At that moment, Lionel sat in a blank room. This was the best way he could describe it. The walls were a dull gray. The singular chair he sat on was a dull gray. The singular table before him was a dull gray. It was even difficult to see the outline of the door to this place. It was as though Lionel had been tossed into a cube with no exit. After a few minutes turned to almost an hour, Lionel felt a keen sense of déjà vu. He had a flashback to the time Pope Margrave wasted his time. But this time he didn't have the option to leave at all. Lionel yawned. Since they wanted to make him wait, that was fine. Lionel took out a pillow and a blanket, climbed onto the table, and fell into a deep sleep. Soon, the sound of light snoring filled the small room. Chapter 338. Lionel fell into a deep sleep almost immediately. Of course, he was using the meditation rest technique his father had taught him. But to the outside world, he was out cold without any understanding of what was happening around him. When Lionel entered this place, he realized many things. For one, these people didn't take him very seriously. They didn't restrain him, nor did they take his things away. It was very likely they believed he was weak. Lionel didn't mind allowing this illusion to continue. But at the same time, he knew that it very well may not be an illusion at all. Lionel had never seen a fourth-dimensional entity battle. However, according to the information he had, no matter how powerful one was within a lower dimension, it was impossible to challenge a higher one with very few exceptions. Lionel didn't know how true this was or if the crystallization of his force could help bridge this gap. But he didn't feel like finding out by putting his life on the line. All Lionel knew was that if he didn't rest his mind, he would be at an even greater disadvantage. So that was exactly what he did. Without a care for anything going on around him, he entered a deep dreamland. By some stroke of coincidence, or maybe due to the fact Lionel was right about them not taking him seriously, no one was monitoring Lionel. They likely believed that they could sweat Lionel out just like any other prisoner. If they let him sit alone for a long while, he'd probably spill out everything he knew when he finally saw another person. Unfortunately, due to their lack of bothering to monitor him, none of them realized that the young man they thought they were pressuring was taking a nice nap. Across the universe, it could be said that there were countless centers of power. But more often than not, these powers would have the shadow of stronger entities to their backs. And those stronger entities would have even stronger backers. This was simply the way of the world. On Earth, which county didn't have a city backing it? Which city wasn't backed by a state or province? Which state or province didn't have a country behind it? This was simply how things functioned. In this new world order where having and not having resources was the difference between life and death, powers who could stand to support others had their hands in as many pots as possible. When things are put into this perspective, it truly isn't a surprise that Earth was targeted in such a way. Even under the protection and overwatch of so many powerful existences, there were some with enough backing that still dared to make a move. In such a complicated environment, it was too difficult to hold such powers accountable for their actions. So they acted with impunity. And if they failed, so what? Who would call them out for it? Of course, there were some that tried to call out the wrongs of these powers. But how long did these foolish individuals survive for? Once again, it seemed as though someone didn't know their place. Aeliard has died. The room wasn't dark and sinister as one might expect. In fact, it was well lit and lavishly furnished. And as though to prove that these entities truly had nothing to hide or didn't deem it necessary to hide anything, this meeting took place within the private room of a bustling high-class restaurant. Oh, That's unfortunate. I assume everything was handled appropriately? Silence fell over the room. This lack of response seemed to catch everyone's attention. Their careless demeanors paused for a moment in place of several sneers. So it seems someone else doesn't know their place? Just deal with them as usual. Everyone around the table seemed to agree with this. It seemed that there was no need for further discussion. Leave it to the head of that quadrant. Agreed. The conversation started and ended just as quickly. To these men and women, what was a small fry from a pseudo-fourth-dimensional world even worth? The fact they wasted a few seconds of their day on such an ant was already too much respect in their eyes. The decision of these entities quickly moved down the ranks, jumping through several chains of command before finally making it the ears it needed to make it to. The man was tall and lanky, carrying a pale complexion that made it seem as though he was either a foot into the grave or one step out of it. Commander Scythe. An attendant respectfully knelt before the man, yet he didn't even turn back. He stood looking out a wide curved window. Stars and asteroids shot across his vision as planets and moon shone beautifully in the distance. It was the kind of scene only a handful of people from Earth had seen personally. Yet, in this new world order, anyone with a little bit power could lay eyes on such a scene. Despite the lack of an answer, the attendant didn't dare to make another sound, continuing to kneel in silence. Eventually he spoke. Leave the information here. You can go. The voice sounded just as dead as the man's sunken expression. Who knew if it was because it had been too long since his last meal, or if this man was really dead, but his skin was pressed so flush against his cheeks that it seemed the bone might tear through it at any moment. Scythe picked up the files as the door to his office was closed. When he finished reading them, a flicker of disdain couldn't help but flash within his eyes. Lionel Morales? They wanted him to personally take care of a brat? Was this supposed to be a joke? Scythe shook his head and pressed a button. Find out for me where this Lionel Morales is. It's too painful to descend to the pseudo-fourth dimension. I expect no mistakes or else I'll have your head. Yes, sir. A voice came from the other side. Scythe walked back to enjoying his view, the clanking of his armor being audible with his every step. If Lionel had been there, he would have noticed an eerily familiar uniform. Robes that split into 4 pieces at the waist. Legs covered in sheet armor beneath them. A pin that looked like the cross between a star and cross on the lapel. Chapter 339. The sudden opening of a door shook Lionel out of his sleeping state. He yawned and stretched, sitting up from the table. He had to say that sleeping on a table wouldn't have been the most comfortable experience for him in the past. But after practicing to the standard stage, it might as well have been a soft bed to the current him. Lionel wiped the tears and sleep from his eyes, finally locking eyes with those that walked into the room. There were 2 individuals, 1 man and 1 woman. They both wore the same split robes and metallic leg sleeves. These uniforms are quite cool. Lionel thought playfully to himself. I wonder how I can join? Of course, Lionel was just having a joke at the expense of himself. With his luck in joining organizations, he'd probably be being hunted to his death within another few days. Still, that didn't change the fact he felt these outfits were quite stylish. Sometimes even Lionel himself forgot he was a teenage boy. Coach had always said, look good, play good. The better one felt, the better they could perform. It seemed that this organization, whatever it was, seemed to take this quite seriously as well. While Lionel was observing the pair, the 2 of them were looking toward him with incredulous expressions. Wasn't this young man supposed to be sweating their appearance? Why the hell is it that he was sleeping? The young woman wrinkled her nose. It seemed that a negative effect of locking Lionel in here for so long was that his smell had been highly concentrated into this area. Lionel slid off the table and put his blanket and pillow away. Flakes of dried blood fell from his body and coated the table, but he didn't bother to clean it. He felt the cleanliness of the room had nothing to do with him, quite frankly. Though he had been cleansed twice by his 2-star constitution, and could even stay fresh for longer than normal humans, given enough time, he would still end up in such a state. He was still very much mortal. Lionel sat down on the chair as though nothing had happened and smiled lightly. Might I ask what I've been brought in for now? Compared to the first time they saw him, Lionel's gaze was much sharper and focused. It seemed that he had really needed that nap. It seemed it might have been an issue to leave him here alone for so long. Hearing Lionel's question, the pair soon regained their level of professionalism. Sitting across from Lionel, as though they couldn't see the flakes of blood and dirt on the table, or smell the horrid stench in the air, Lionel took out the dictionary and placed it on the table to help him translate. "It's our job to monitor suspicious activity," the man replied with a deadpan expression. "In addition, you match the description of several fugitives we've been looking for." Lionel smiled bitterly. It seemed that it really was his style of dress that got him thrust into this situation. Had he taken his time to clean up, maybe he wouldn't even be here. "I apologize for giving that sort of impression. The reason I look like this is because I recently cleared a subdimensional zone on my home world and used one of my rewards in exchange for a ticket to terrain. In my excitement, I came here right after I left without thinking things through. I've never left my home world before." Lionel explained his side of the story politely. Of course, much of it was a lie, and in some ways, he really could be considered a fugitive. At the very least, he had run away from his home planet for reasons. But they didn't need to know that. Plus, Lionel said with a bitter expression, "I'm just a third-dimensional existence from a new world. How could I be one of the fugitives you're looking for?" Though the pair before him didn't react much to his words, Lionel's senses were exceptionally keen. He could see that they had already believed as much before even stepping into this room. Lionel wasn't sure why they brought him in. It might have been to do their due diligence, or for another reason he was unaware of. But he could tell that they didn't truly plan on punishing him. Sometimes people with power just enjoyed wasting the time of those beneath them. Lionel felt that this might just be one of those cases. Still, since he was weak and had no backing, this was simply one of those things he had to accept with a smile on his face, even though he was furious inside. As expected, the pair didn't respond directly to Lionel's question. The female flipped her palm and took out a folder of documents. "You will be monitored by our people for the next 3 years. As long as you do nothing to violate the laws, you will be relieved of this mark on your record." Lionel's smile suddenly faded into a deep frown. They wanted the right to monitor him for 3 years despite the fact he hadn't done anything wrong? What kind of nonsense was this? Was this supposed to be some sort of joke? "You want to monitor me for 3 years despite the fact I haven't done anything wrong?" Lionel asked coldly. The man sneered. "If you haven't done anything wrong, what's the issue with being monitored?" Lionel nearly snapped at this sort of reasoning. If it wasn't for his better judgment, he might have just pulled out his spear right then and there. Maybe in the past, Lionel wouldn't care as much about this. After all, he truly had done nothing wrong, and thanks to his experience with the Empire, he was already used to his every action being monitored. However, it was precisely because of the Empire that he was becoming more and more sensitive to such things. And it only made things worse that he was being treated like this just due to ridiculous, unwarranted suspicion. Lionel's jaw clenched, his gaze turning a frosty shade of green. Without a word, he signed the documents before him. As though a contract had bound him, the documents glowed. Before Lionel could react, a light shot from within the documents and onto his forehead. A moment later, a thin black brand spread between his brows as though marking him. Lionel's fury was stoked several more levels. He had already read through the documents and knew that this would happen, but when he actually felt it, he couldn't help but feel the urge to do something he would regret. Seeing Lionel try to maintain control over his emotions, the woman remained expressionless while the man sneered. So what if he was angry? He was branded like a slave and couldn't even do a thing about it. Chapter 340. Lionel closed his eyes, the tumultuous flow of his blood slowing down to a crawl. Rage wouldn't get him anything, anger wouldn't get him anything. After a long while, Lionel slowly stood and walked toward the door. He didn't say anything toward the female-male pair. Nothing he said would have changed anything to begin with. Seeing Lionel's reaction, the young woman remained expressionless while the male's sneer deepened. Wasn't this sort of reaction obvious? Even if Lionel felt wrong, so what? He may have been worth something on his own world, but in this place, he was nothing but an ant that could be squashed at the whims of others. Lionel stepped out from the room and left. Even without stepping foot outside the building, he could feel the glances he received as though each was boring into his very being. The mark that hovered above his forehead was too distinctive. Anyone could see it at a single glance. Lionel didn't even bother to try and cover it up. He knew that there would be no point. If a simple headband could circumvent such a thing, whatever organization this was truly wouldn't be worth very much to begin with. Eventually, Lionel pushed open the doors and stood at the top of a tall and wide set of stairs. For this organization to hold such a large property in such a bustling city, their standing was clear. Every square inch in a place like this likely cost an astronomical amount. As someone from Earth who was familiar with overpopulation problems, Lionel knew this more than others. Lionel looked up to the top of the building, seeing the very same star and cross symbol. To this point, he still didn't know what the title of this organization was, nor had anyone ever mentioned it to him. It seemed to be one of those things that everyone knew of, but also didn't dare to speak of easily. Considering his style of dress, where he stood, and what hung above his forehead, Lionel stood out like a sore thumb. There was no limit of individuals who observed him from afar, whispering to one another. However, Lionel continued to stand there as though burning the image of that star and cross into his mind. Then he turned and walked away. "Impossible, we don't accept your kind here. Please leave. All of our rooms are booked, sir. Please accept our greatest Apollo." "Ah, yes, right away. The room has already been cleaned and prepped. This way, please." "Scram. I don't care if you're willing to pay double." Lionel expressionlessly strolled out of his final attempt. He felt nothing but numbness by this point. After a while, he looked up toward the setting sun. It seemed as though the whole day had already gone by. In truth, he hadn't spent the whole day searching for accommodations. Most of the time had been wasted away in that organization's building. It was only the past half an hour that he had spent moving from location to location, hoping to find a place of residence. Though Lionel had the segmented cube, he knew that he couldn't so easily or casually use it. This was no longer Earth. There were plenty of people he had to fear here. As of now, he had only used the dictionary as a translator, so no one grew greedy about it. Who would care about such a primitive translation treasure? However, the segmented cube was a spatial treasure capable of housing life. If others came to know of it, Lionel would be hunted to the ends of terrain. Lionel saw a food stall in the distance and suddenly realized it had been a long time since he ate anything that he didn't roast himself. Though he had a practically infinite supply of meat thanks to the snow globes, it got bland eating nothing but unseasoned meat all the time. However, before Lionel could even approach, the middle-aged woman who ran the stand gave him a stare as though daring him to come and suffer the consequences. Lionel shook his head and sighed. There was no purpose in staying in this city anymore. Lionel felt several eyes on him as he walked toward the outside of the city. How am I supposed to find Aina like this? No one would give Lionel the time of day. Not only could he not find a place to stay, he couldn't find a place to eat. As he was now, it would be impossible to gather any information. How could he if no one would talk to him? They say that this mark is only supposed to be a sign of suspicion and not criminality, but who would want a suspicious person around them? It was practically guaranteed to stay this way. The city gates will be closing in half an hour, and will not open again until dawn tomorrow. Though the guard could see the mark on Lionel's forehead, he still casually said these words. After all, it was his job to say at least this much. That said, he didn't even look directly at Lionel as he spoke. Lionel just shook his head and bitterly laughed. Stay in the city? For what? To sleep on the streets? What was the point of that? At least if he left the city, he could take another rest in comfort, so long as he found a deserted region. Also, clothing stores refused entry, so unless he repaired his chain necklace, he would have to make his own clothing. Either way, he would only be able to do this with his segmented cube, and he would only be safe to use his segmented cube if he left this place. Thanks, Lionel said non-committedly. The guard and his colleagues shook their heads and soon began to converse amongst themselves, not minding Lionel anymore. It was just when Lionel was almost out of earshot that he heard something that caught his interest by relying on the dictionary. Chapter 341. Another fugitive, Tisk. Technically no, that was just a mark of suspicion. They're only monitoring him. Poor guy probably just got caught up in something that was over his head. Whatever it is, he's pretty stupid to leave the city. He's just asking to die. He hasn't even stepped out of the third dimension yet. But he wanted to survive outside of the city walls? Who do you think he'll fall to, an invalid or a beast? Let's place some bets. The guards spoke as they pleased. To them, it was impossible for Lionel to hear them from so far away. And even if they knew he could hear them, it was highly unlikely that they'd even care enough to stop. Well, what's his alternative? He probably couldn't find a place to stay, and he was probably stupid enough to come here with a one-way ticket. You think someone like him could even afford a ticket back to his own world? Lionel smiled bitterly. That was true. He had no way back to Earth for now. Though that wasn't because he couldn't afford it. Unlike Earth, Terrain had teleportation pads. This meant that Lionel didn't need to enter a zone to earn a Tier 9 black reward to go back. He just had to pay the appropriate fee. There were only two issues with this. First, he needed Earth's coordinates. This was simple enough, he could just ask the dictionary about it. The second issue is much harder to deal with. He had to actually be allowed to leave. Even though no one had ever said anything about his travel being restricted, the teleportation pads were still owned by the cities. Just like he could be rejected from entering their hotels, he would be stopped from using their other services as well. As for why people who apparently couldn't stand his guts would stop him from leaving, that had an explanation as well. No one wanted to be complicit in the escape of a suspicious entity. There was no way they'd help him. The guards laughed amongst one another. Still, who do you think those fugitives they're looking for are? The guards fell into silence. All of them looked toward the rookie that asked such a stupid question, as though they couldn't wait to skin him alive. The rookie, seemingly realizing he said something wrong, lowered his head. He didn't even mumble an apology, hoping that no one acknowledged what he had just asked. They all knew that Terrain was currently in a state of turmoil, a crossroads of sorts. Some wanted to ensure their world reached the fifth dimension, while others felt that doing such a thing was useless. As though the internal conflict wasn't bad enough, there were people pulling strings from the background, and it could be said that those who were pulling these strings were quite invested in ensuring that Terrain abandoned its chances of becoming a fifth-dimensional world. Lionel found the sudden silence of the guards to be quite interesting. It seemed as though this was another open secret everyone was aware of, but didn't dare to speak of. Anyway, the rookie tried to change the subject. I heard that another power suffered a loss at the hands of the sword monstress. The guards looked at the rookie weirdly. What kind of name is that supposed to be? How am I supposed to know? I'm not the one that came up with the name. I hear she's a woman and a monster, so they call her the monstress. They say she's built and looks like a gorilla and wields a 3-meter-long sword. Thus sword monstress. The guards looked at one another, all simultaneously sent a kick toward the rookie. What a lame story. Lionel shook his head and left. They weren't talking about anything he was interested in any longer. A long while later, the road Lionel traveled along began to grow less and less well-kept. It slowly became narrower and less paved. Soon, weeds and grasses began to spring up all along it. By now, Lionel had left the range of the city. Anyone who was hoping to reach the city gates within the next half hour before closing had long since passed him by. It was safe to say that he was fairly alone at this point. Soon, the flat land began to turn into a forest that quickly grew in density. After reaching this point, Lionel entered a state of high alert. On his way here, he had crossed two groups heading toward the city. But both of them had had individuals he felt could squash him like a bug. If it wasn't for his rags and his weakness, there was no telling if he would have been robbed and killed or not. This told him two things. First, this meant the fourth dimension was a completely different animal. Lionel didn't know why he didn't feel the pressure of this world, but he knew that he couldn't underestimate it just because of this. Second, Lionel realized that having such powerful people in your midst was practically a necessity if he wanted to travel through this world. Of course, Lionel had one advantage: his internal sight. He could trust it in most cases and dodge danger before he even reached it. After crystallizing his spirit pressure, He could see up to half a kilometer away, even in this fourth-dimensional world. Back on Earth, his range was easily over a kilometer. Lionel could only hope that a half-kilometer and his instincts were enough to keep him safe. After he traveled a decent enough depth, Lionel began to sink into the ground. It takes more force now. Lionel frowned, but he could only keep pouring his force out. He had already been aware that multiple things would be more difficult after coming to a fourth-dimensional world. He could only accept it. Soon, Lionel's head had disappeared from the surface, completely vanishing. He had one main goal in mind. He had to finish his force crystallization and complete his 10th node. Only then would he had some more assurance in staying in this backwards world. Chapter 342. Lionel sunk deep into the ground and summoned the segmented cube. Truth be told, he didn't feel 100% safe in this region. There was no telling what kind of powerful beasts could burrow through the ground. In addition, as things stood now, he was still being tracked. There was also no telling what those people would do with that information. Lionel shook his head and entered the abode setting. He had no idea how he could possibly get so unlucky to land himself in this situation. But here he was, he could only make the most of it. Could it be that something like this happened to Aina too? Lionel's heart suddenly clenched. He remembered that when he sent Aina here, they had quite literally just survived a bombing. It could even be argued that her state was worse than his current own. On top of that, she was severely injured and a beautiful woman alone in this world. There was no telling what could happen. Lionel thought back to that bad feeling he had had and clenched his teeth. A murderous aura seemed to still the air around him. Lionel hardly noticed it, nor did he realize when he could suddenly exude such bloodthirst. But all he knew was that if they dared to touch one hair on her head, he wouldn't care about what consequences going against them could bring. Lionel stripped himself of his clothes and began to slowly wash himself. It was hard to tell if he was being deliberate or not, but his movements were paced and methodical as though each and every one of his actions had the utmost importance. After a long while, he was cleaned and refreshed. Then he entered his room and sank into his bed, falling asleep once again. Lionel awoke feeling better than he ever had. His body felt like a powerful spring, ready to launch itself into the skies. His injuries were completely healed, even ones hidden well within the depths of his being. And his mind was clear, even clearer than it had been after his first nap. With that, he entered the lab setting and set his sights on the many blueprints his father had left behind. Truthfully, these blueprints didn't have some powerful, nation-rending treasures depicted on them. Rather, they were mostly written as guiders to Lionel's training. As such, most of them were actually related to aspects of forming divine armor, as it was an outrageously complicated process. The general rule of force crafters was that treasures with more parts tended to be more complicated. So one could imagine how difficult forming one's divine armor was. Even the simplest designs would have upwards of 40 to 50 parts, something that was far beyond the current Lionel. That said, Lionel wasn't looking toward these blueprints to start on his divine armor. As things stood now, that wasn't a valuable use of his time. Lionel scanned through and picked out a blueprint before unfurling it on his crafter's table. The design that revealed itself was a simple set of clothes that could provide decent defenses. At the very least, they wouldn't break so easily in battle, and would also help Lionel stand out less. After all, the sweatpants of Earth looked quite odd in this new world. One of the most important parts about forming divine armor was understanding the human body and how it moved in relation to its parts. Tailoring clothing was one of the first steps that his father had laid out for him. Lionel memorized the blueprint and imprinted it into his mind using Dream Sculpt. Then he began to choose materials. Lionel's snow globes were filled with third-dimensional beasts thanks to his time on the Project Hunt Island. Picking out beasts with sturdy hides was just a matter of reaching out a finger and pointing. Like this, an odd scene of a naked boy tailoring his first set of clothing could be seen. Phew! Lionel patted down his robes, causing them to slam down against his body in a whipping motion. They had a heavy, leathery texture to them, and were a deep black. They followed a similar design to the clothing of that Star and Cross organization, and split at his waist. But since Lionel didn't want to get into any unnecessary trouble, He only split it down once from just below his belly button. That way, the robes wouldn't obstruct his movements despite their heft. Compared to the robes, Lionel's pants were much looser and freer. They were made of an exceptionally light material and fluttered with the slightest movement. If one looked closely, it was clear that it wasn't the material that was light as much as the force arts Lionel wove into it made it so. Good enough. Lionel nodded to himself, slicking his hair back. His long hair was really getting to be a problem, but cutting it was even more difficult. In fact, as he progressed through strengthening his body, it only got tougher and tougher. Lionel no longer had the means to cut his hair even if he wanted to, as it seemed to be even more powerful than his body. Toward this issue, he could only shake his head and let his bronzed hair sway toward the small of his back. He could only hope he didn't become a male Rapunzel in the future. Lionel took off his robes, leaving him shirtless. Now that he had some real work to do, there was no need to leave such heavy protection on. Little Tolly shot up excitedly, bouncing across the table like a little silver basketball. Lionel smiled. Ever since Blackstar went into a deep sleep, this little one had been feeling lonely. Even though the two were always at each other's throats, Lionel could tell that they were a bit fond of one another. The main reason Lionel left his zone later than Monet and Violet Rain was because he had used his remaining time with Uncle Montez to infuse the mimicry blood into little Blackstar. That way he could assure that absolutely nothing went wrong. So right now little Blackstar was assimilating with the blood. But by the time Lionel finished, the little guy should be up and raring to go. Lionel took a deep breath and began to meditate. He was very close to reaching perfection in his crystallization. Once he did, it would be time. Chapter 343. The days slowly ticked by, but Lionel hardly noticed them. His body was as light as a feather, following along a natural progression that didn't even seem difficult to him. Then one day, bang! Shoo! A hot steam shot all around Lionel's body. Well, at first look it was just steam. But upon second inspection, one would be shocked to find that it was actually force. Tangible force. This wasn't the kind of force only those with internal sight could see. Even mortals who hadn't come into contact with force a day in their lives would very clearly be able to see it. This sort of shocking crystallization was the likes of which even King Arthur hadn't reached. Lionel took a deep breath. All the dense fog around him seemed to surge into his body, entering through his pores and boring into his soul, leaving him feeling incomparably refreshed. I did it. This should also be the strong stage. Lionel realized that when his body suddenly sucked in all his force like that, his body broke through another shackle and reached the strong stage. It had to be remembered that refining one's metal body in the third dimension was split into 5 phases. The weak, standard, strong, superior, and perfection stage. This could be considered the foundation one laid to enter the 4th dimension. This was another reason Lionel wasn't worried about not having the rest of dimensional cleanse just yet. Even if he couldn't progress to the 4th dimension with his force, he could still do so with his soul force, he could still comprehend the 4 seasons realm, and he could also bring his metal body into the 4th dimension as well. Regardless of which of these 3 paths it was, each of them would give him the strength of a 4th dimensional entity. So what did it matter? As things stood now, if Lionel wanted, he could bring his metal body to the 4th dimension this very instant. But as a person who opened all 9 doors, how could he waste his potential like that? He had to reach superior stage at worst before progressing. Lionel flexed his forearms. My body is already nearing the strength of a pseudo 4th dimensional Oregon. It wouldn't be easy even for 4th dimensional entities to harm me. Lionel took a deep breath. This gave him even more assurance to form his 10th node. He knew that no matter how much he planned it all out, the process would still be impossibly painful. After all, he was trying to break through restrictions set by the universe itself. Even if this could be considered to be a minor restriction in the grand scheme, to the current Lionel, it was an insurmountable mountain. Lionel took a deep breath to adjust himself. Then he took another long bath and deep sleep before finally returning, his body brimming with vitality. No matter how you looked at him, Lionel seemed to be a pointed spear. All the hatred, humiliation, and grievance he had suffered those few days ago seemed to become his whetstone. sharpening his edge to unimaginable degrees. Let's begin. Lionel spoke to no one in particular. His breath shot out like an arrow, trembling the space before his lips. He sat crossed-legged, a vial of thick, milky liquid in his hands. This was none other than the dew he had collected in the several months he had the stalactite for. Just a single drop was more than enough to form a node, but Lionel actually had almost a dozen. In that moment, Lionel began to circulate dimensional cleanse in full force. The speed of his rotation his stars experienced accelerated, and his body suddenly felt bloated. Lionel split his mind in two directions, both focusing in on his kidneys. Lionel had calculated everything out. If he tried to form his nodes one at a time, he would get stone-walled when he tried to form his 10th. The only chance he stood was to form them both at the very same time. For the current Lionel, splitting his mind in two directions was as easy as breathing. After crystallizing his spirit pressure to perfection, he could already split it over 8 ways. So, how could 2 possibly be an issue? Lionel guides his force, stimulating his life energies, rearranging the cells of kidneys. The kidney was an extraordinarily important part of the body. It was responsible for cleaning away many of the impurities of the blood. However, for anyone who had ever suffered a kidney stone before, they would know that even the smallest particle could cause everything to go wrong. For Lionel to rearrange his cells, though it wasn't as dangerous as when he had done so with his brain, the immediate pain was definitely far more potent. However, from the outside, one would never guess that Lionel was in pain. In just an hour, Lionel had already rearranged 100 cells worth of space, creating a nice pocket for his 2 nodes. To this point, despite the pain, everything had gone perfectly. All he had to do now was form his node within the pockets he had created and connect them with his others. By then, his foundation within the 3rd dimension would become perfect. Lionel's chest expanded, his thick force building. In one swift motion, he unhesitatingly swung his head back and gulped down the whole vial of dew. Bang! Lionel's body suddenly expanded by a size. However, it wasn't proportional in the slightest. He looked as though he had suddenly gained 100 pounds, and that his body would burst at any moment. However, under the strength of his metal body, he kept himself together as his face contorted. Blood leaked from his lips, but he willed himself to focus. In that instant, all the force in his body rushed to 2 locations, carving out a node pathway with impunity. Lionel's brow trembled, but he bit down on his teeth hard. He compressed his bloated body, squeezing his muscles and flexing with all his might. Cracks began to spread not only across himself, but even the floors of the lab setting. It seemed that he might implode at any given moment. But it was exactly then that he felt the node pathways complete. One to his left kidney and the other to his right. Just when Lionel was about to feel ecstatic, he suddenly felt as though someone had stabbed through the right side of his body and twisted the knife. In that moment, a scar Lionel had hardly thought about his whole life suddenly lit on fire. From a faint mark near his liver, it suddenly exploded, radiating out with a blinding light. Ack! Lionel couldn't control his roar. The pain was so excruciating that his eyes rolled back, until only their whites remained. His body convulsed uncontrollably. There was no need to even mention his breakthrough attempt. He had completely lost control of his force, his body bursting apart at its seams. He flopped to the ground, his body spasming as blood leaked from his orifices. The scar continued to burn brighter and brighter, stretching up the side of his body as though to swallow him whole. Lionel could have never thought that the reason he felt 9 nodes weren't enough was precisely because of this scar his father mentioned in the note he left to him all that time ago. Chapter 344. Lionel felt as though a blade was twisting through his organs. He had never experienced pain on this level in his entire life. It was to the point that no amount of will could keep his mind clear. Whatever semblance of control he had had over the process of his body had completely collapsed, resulting in a rampaging force surging throughout his body. Anyone else in this sort of situation would have long since died. In fact, the moment they swallowed that amount of dew, they would have exploded on the spot. That said, Lionel's current situation had little to nothing to do with the amount of force he had swallowed. In fact, it had nothing to do with him trying to form a 10th node either. It was entirely related to the twisting pain at his hip. To this point, Lionel still had no idea why his father ever mentioned the scar above his hip. Lionel had never been aware of where it came from. Considering he played football, he had never thought much about it to begin with. Injuries always seemed to pop up randomly for anyone who played the sport. He had even broken his ribs during the last game he played. Why would he think so much about a barely visible scar? However, Lionel could have never imagined that such a small matter would blow up to this level. Lionel's mind was completely blank. His eyes had rolled back, making his vision completely black. It felt as though the only thing he could feel was pain. The only thing he could hear were his screams. The only thing he could smell was the metallic stench of his own blood. Then it all began to turn faint. As though his life was being pulled along by a string completely out of his control. He stalked closer toward death. And maybe the worst part was that Lionel wasn't even aware. Maybe it was because his will wasn't tempered enough. Maybe it was because this pain was truly beyond the limits of his body. But there was nothing he could do to change his own fate. As Lionel was straddling the line of life and death, Scythe had finally gotten the report he had been waiting several days for. After reading it, he furrowed his brow. With the level of their organization, digging up information on a mere third-dimensional existence was too easy. However, Lionel's information was too weird. For one, his grandfather was the emperor of his world. Having a world unified beneath one force was incredibly rare to begin with. It was an extraordinary feat, and it was impossible for any simple existence to accomplish this, especially when it was a world with so much talent like Earth. This alone wasn't enough to cause Scythe to frown. Who cared about the emperor of a pseudo-fourth-dimensional world? He might find it troublesome if Earth was a pseudo-fifth-dimensional world, but they were very clearly far from this. What made him raise an eyebrow wasn't the information, but rather the lack of it. Firstly, there wasn't a single hint of information about Lionel's maternal grandmother, an Emperor Fox's wife. It was to the point they hadn't even managed to find her name. No birth records, no name, no death certificate, nothing. As though that wasn't enough, his mother had vanished off the face of the planet. She hadn't been heard of in decades. In fact, the time she had disappeared for far outstripped Lionel's own age, which was more than enough to raise some eyebrows. Then there was Lionel's father. Rather than vanishing, the issue with him was that he appeared out of nowhere. There were records that were very clearly forged of his birth and early life, but it was all too simple for Scythe's organization to find out how fake these things were. On top of that, he suddenly vanished after the metamorphosis began. There wasn't a single record of him, nothing. Even this aside, there was Lionel himself. To summarize the boy as a troublemaker was an understatement. The near destruction of a fort, the murder of several hidden family members, the falling out with the rebels of Earth, of course, none of these things were enough to move Scythe. What did he care what a teen did against such weak organizations? The real issue was how all of this fit together. There were a lot of organizations eyeing Earth right now. In fact, even without the mission he was given, Scythe already had Earth on his radar. This was simply one of those things the public was in the dark about while those with some real weight to them were already taking advantage of. What Scythe wanted to know was whether or not Lionel and his mysterious family was part of those eyeing Earth as a pie they wanted a slice of. If this was the case, then Scythe might very well become a scapegoat in a power struggle simply by virtue of the fact he was unlucky enough to be saddled with this mission. Thinking to this point, Scythe's sunken eyes narrows, his already pale features growing a shade whiter. When he entered such deep thought, his blood seemed to slow by a measure, making him appear to be even more ghost-like. No matter what actions I take now, they have to be done with the utmost secrecy. Scythe knew that he didn't have the option to reject this mission. This was simply the plight of the weak. However, he also knew that his organization wouldn't throw him out to dry either. If they set such a precedent, it wouldn't be long before no one was willing to work for them. This ultimately meant that he needed to set a seed of appropriate amounts of doubt. As long as there wasn't conclusive evidence that he was the one who acted, he should be able to keep a certain level of protection for himself. Where is he now? Scythe finally turned the attendant who still knelt on the ground. From our information, he has long since left Earth using a teleportation ticket. But since these tickets can only teleport someone within a quadrant, There were only about 200 worlds he could have gone to. After looking through the teleportation records of them all, there are 5 worlds that fit the timing and only one registered to Lionel Morales. He should be on terrain, coordinate XX. XX. XX at the moment. Scythe nodded. Prepare everything. I want to leave within the hour. Yes. Chapter 345. Scythe landed on the teleportation platform. Instead of looking around toward his surroundings, he frowned for a moment and closed his eyes, slowly regaining his bearing. Despite the fact this was a private teleportation pad in the most secretive location the organization had to offer, there were already 2 individuals ready to receive Scythe. Neither said a word as Scythe regained his bearings, and neither did Scythe acknowledge them. Had Lionel been there, he would have immediately recognized these 2 as the very same male and female pair that had branded him with the mark that now hovered over his forehead. When Scythe finally opened his eyes, the 2 of them stepped forward. Officer Finn greets Commander. Officer Thorn greets Commander. Scythe looked toward the 2 of them indifferently. The title of officer was just another way of saying unranked in their organization, while these officers all referred to those above them as commander. It was similar to how some cultures called even those unrelated to them uncle or big brother, but in this case, rather than being a polite address, it was a way of drawing a line between true members of the organization and those who weren't worthy. I received information that a certain Lionel Morales came through the city. You have 10 minutes to get me information about his whereabouts and other pertinent information. You may leave. Finn and Thorn froze, looking toward each other with their heads still bowed. Scythe frowned. What? He could clearly see that there was something wrong. The male officer, Finn, looked up carefully and explained everything from start to finish. The most recent information we have of him is that he has left the city. If Commander wants, we can use the monitoring brand to retrieve him. The truth was that these 2 officers hadn't put much stock in Lionel. Though they branded him, that was a matter of convenience rather than necessity. They knew well that the matter was an inconvenience to Lionel, and also knew that it was unnecessary to go so far. But so what? Who cared how Lionel felt about it? Never could they have expected that someone like Scythe would personally descend for someone they put no importance on. When Scythe heard the story, his frown couldn't help but deepen. Now this matter he had been hoping to keep under wraps was likely the talk of much of the city. This alone might have been fine, but the real problem was that now Lionel's conflict with their organization was public. There was no getting rid of this stain. Even if there was no direct evidence, if Lionel's mysterious backing was strong enough, they might not give a damn and kill those responsible anyway. This was the kind of power true strength could give someone. Scythe's frown deepened, causing Thorn and Finn to break out into a cold sweat. Even the usually expressionless Thorn couldn't help but tremble. After a while, Scythe's frown smoothed out. Since others could use him as a scapegoat, why couldn't he do the same? Who said he had to get directly involved? It was already a problem that he had come here personally. But there was good news as well. For one, he had come through a private port. Secondly, because he was trying to be secretive to begin with, these 2 were the only ones who knew about his arrival. And coincidentally, these 2 were the only ones with direct contact and interaction with Lionel as well. This made things as perfect and watertight as they could be. Good. Scythe suddenly spoke. Make sure to monitor him closely, very closely. Should he show any signs of stepping out of line, don't hesitate to punish him according to the law. I will be doing an inspection on this branch for the next while. Do as you usually do. With that, Scythe walked by the 2 officers and disappeared down the corridor, leaving the 2 of them stunned. They weren't sure how they were supposed to take this information. Was there a hidden meaning? Were they supposed to take it at face value? What do we do? Finn's confident sneer was nowhere to be seen. He looked more like a wounded pup who had been abandoned by his owner. Thorn remained silent for a long while. Clearly, she too was confused. In the end, she spoke hesitantly. This may be a test. The first thing Commander asked about when he came to was about this Lionel character. It's clear that his goal in coming here was related to this young man. But he became apprehensive after hearing we already had dealings with him. On top of that, Commander came through the private pad only used in special circumstances. It's obvious that Commander wants to use us as scapegoats. It's clear that this Lionel's background isn't as simple as we once thought. Finn shivered at these words. It seemed that he too had already thought of this. It was just that he didn't want to believe it. But this is still an opportunity, Thorn said slowly. If we can kill this Lionel secretly, or manage to kill him in an above-board manner without bending or violating any rules, I think there's a chance we can turn this disaster into a chance to rise up the ranks. Finn clenched his jaw. It's already impossible to kill him secretly. The only chance is to use the latter option. Agreed. The only question was, how could they manipulate this Lionel into making a mistake worth his life? Deep within the corridor, Scytha, who the two thought had already left, curled his lip. It seems he was quite satisfied with the conclusion the two officers had come to. With that, he turned and truly walked away completely. This is still interesting though. Scytha thought to himself. This branch seems to be on high alert for fugitives, but why be on alert to the point of coincidentally arresting a third-dimensional ant? It was quite the coincidence indeed. Their organization had two conflicts with Lionel, neither related to the other. It seemed that there was something interesting going on in this quadrant. Since he was here, he might as well dip a toe in and profit as well. What the two officers and Scytha had no idea about was that as they were speaking, the young man they were plotting the death of was already at death's door. Lionel lied convulsing in a pool of his own blood. By now, little Tali was hopping around anxiously, but the little guy had no idea what to do. The scar along Lionel's side seemed to be growing more and more vicious with each passing moment. From afar, it looked as though Lionel was boiling from the inside out. The scar was like a burning hot coal, shining with a blazing red-orange light. It was at that moment that an already terrible situation seemed to get worse. The scar finally stopped growing and began to rapidly shrink. But, with this shrinkage came a violent suction energy. Not only was Lionel's own blood suddenly swallowed from around him, but the vitality within his body was being rapidly drained. Soon, Lionel went from a human that was bursting at the seams to a skeleton without an ounce of meat left on his body. His eyes sunk in, their whites flickering about wildly. He looked like he was truly at his end. Chapter 346. Lionel's skin pressed flush against his bone. Soon, it began to crackle and dry like a thin piece of paper. It even seemed like it just might crack like fine glass and perish into a pile of ash at any moment. It was only then that something changed. Badum! Badum! Lionel's chest jolted so violently that it seemed like his heart might leap from his chest. The outline of his ribs were so clear in his current state that it was even vaguely possible to see the sudden activity. His convulsing body shook once more. This time, a projectile of black blood shot out from his mouth as a familiar heat spread all through Lionel's body. If Lionel was conscious, his mind would flash back to the days he spent with his father, and a disgusting green smoothie he had to force down his throat every day. Lionel had believed that he already understood the purpose of his father's concoctions. They had helped his body strengthen faster than others after the metamorphosis despite the fact he wasn't born with an offensive or physical ability. Yet, he could have never thought that these benefits were just mere lingering aftereffects. They couldn't even represent a single % of what their true strength was. At that moment, three things began to occur in Lionel's body at once. In his left kidney, a large force node of 100 cells had connected with the rest of his body and began to shimmer in full force. In his ethereal glabella, a sudden surge of soul force began to spin violently around itself, quickly forming a third star that sent pulses of pure energy outward. And, in his right kidney, a golden red stone began to form. No, it was more accurate to say that it had begun to reform, and it was much larger than any one of Lionel's other nodes. In fact, it didn't seem like a normal node at all. Lionel hadn't realized it before, but a portion of his kidney had been cut out. But it had been such a small portion that even when he swept his internal sight over it, he hadn't noticed a thing. It could be said that it only took up the space of a few thousand cells. However, at this moment, not only was the space that had been cut out suddenly filled with a heavy, swirling golden red energy, but it slowly matured, taking over the whole of Lionel's right kidney until it completely morphed. In a process that took several days, Lionel's right kidney turned from a normal organ of flesh and blood to a gem shimmering of gold and scarlet. It was clear that whatever had been cut out of Lionel had not only recovered, but it had also strengthened by countless times compared to the past. But what was most shocking was the fact it took the place of Lionel's 10th node, but was very clearly several times larger than his other nodes. The kidney might not have been a particularly large organ, but it was still formed of hundreds of thousands to millions of cells. Compared to the 100 cells that formed Lionel's other nodes, there wasn't even an appropriate comparison. In addition, compared to the force that usually swirled about Lionel's nodes and nodal pathways, this energy was several levels above anything Lionel had ever come into contact with before. It seemed that Lionel's father had gone a bit overboard in helping his son to recover. By normal convention, Lionel would have eventually helped his kidney mature to this state over a long period of time, but it seemed like this would no longer be necessary. At that moment, the violent changes to Lionel's body slowly came to a stop. As his 3-star constitution completed, a surge of black, putrid liquid flowed out from his pores and mouth, filling the lab setting with a terrible stench. At the same time, the golden red energy of his right kidney seemed to connect with the rest of his body, causing a purification effect that even managed to match the formation of Lionel's 3rd star in a casual manner. And finally, Lionel's body, after going through so much, broke through another barrier and entered the superior stage. It was within his body that the most drastic changes began to occur. Whether by design or coincidence, the golden red energy of Lionel's kidney seemed to resonate with the residual red energy of his runes. Back when Lionel had almost failed and suffered bloodline deviation, he had managed to turn back in the end. But that experience still left a small influence on him. This was why instead of a pure violet, when he entered his true battle state, his eyes would also contain a tinge of red. This redness seemed to be beloved by the energy of Lionel's kidney, and they became attracted to one another. Soon, the slight redness of Lionel's runes became more pronounced. At the same time, the bronze color grew in luster and tended slightly more toward gold. The changes weren't escaped by Lionel's hair, which also became more gold as it actually managed to survive the formation of his 3rd star this time around. But maybe the greatest changes occurred in Lionel's ethereal glabella. At that moment, the faint spirit of his snowy star owl seemed to also be influenced. In fact, compared to Lionel's metal synergy lineage factor, it resonated with this scarlet gold energy on a much deeper level, even to the point of causing faint changes within the 12-sided star. As all these changes continued to take place, Lionel remained in a deep sleep. During that time, the spirit of the segmented cube seemed to not like the fact its insides had been so dirted. So Lionel was swept up and thrust into the bathhouse of the abode setting while the mess he left behind was cleaned. Lionel suddenly gasped awake, his hands erratically touching around his own body as though to make sure it was all still there. It was only then he sighed a breath of relief and realized he had somehow ended up in bed. Did I fail? Lionel sighed. Even if he failed, he thought himself lucky. After all, surviving in such a situation was likely borderline impossible. Hold on, Lionel frowned. If he had failed, why was he uninjured? Could it be that he had only managed to form one node? That was worse than failing altogether because that meant he had no chance of forming his 10th now. Lionel couldn't help but feel a bit down. He sat up, crossing his legs and sinking into meditation. He might as well check the state of his body. He had always known that this was a nearly impossible endeavor, but for whatever reason, he had never even considered failure. Chapter 347. The first thing Lionel noticed was that his force was somewhat tinged with red. At first, he thought that this was a product of forming his 3rd star. But when he checked on the situation of his kidneys, he was left speechless. It became very obvious, very quickly, that the reddish gold energy was coming from his right kidney, which shimmered like a gem within his body. What the hell? Lionel's hand suddenly shot toward his scar, his gaze flashing with an imperceptible light. The truth was that Lionel had never thought much about his scar. He had learned about it from his father's note, but that had been before he even stepped into the Mayan tomb. by the time he went through so many life and death situations and got his hands on the dictionary, something he could finally use to find out more about it, it wasn't even on his mind any longer. As a result, Lionel never got around to asking, "Innate force node?" When Lionel's mind landed on these words, he was suddenly jolted out of his stupor. He remembered that the first time he learned about innate force nodes he had been reading, Dimensional Cleanse. The creator had mentioned them, and even said that created force nodes were no weaker. But looking at his right kidney, Lionel had a hard time imagining that his self-created force nodes could match up. Whether it was in size, quality or robustness, his right kidney far outstripped anything he had ever come across. In fact, it was an even higher quality than his light elemental force, which was an exceptionally high-level energy to begin with. Lionel frowned. Did this scar mean that someone had planted this force node into him? But why had he not noticed it until now? And what was with it being so large? Are all innate force nodes this large? Lionel reached out with his internal strength and tried to communicate with his right kidney's node. Ack! A searing pain suddenly shot through Lionel's body. Just a wisp of the force made him feel as though his body would burn to ash if he continued for even a split second more. Lionel broke out into a cold sweat, collapsing. What the hell? He couldn't even use his own innate force node? What kind of joke was this? Lionel had no idea that he had reawakened his innate force node much earlier than his father had expected. Lionel wasn't supposed to try and form a 10th node. That was simply suicidal. The fact he tried at all was enough for people to look at him as though he was a madman. Unfortunately, or maybe fortunately depending on the perspective, his actions catalyzed the rebirth of his innate force node. But it also made it far more powerful than he was prepared to deal with. Lionel gave up, taking out the dictionary. He really had no idea what was happening. What is going on? Lionel couldn't even come up with pointed questions. He could only ask this. Ever since he left the turbulence of Camelot, the dictionary had begun to work just fine once again. Ping! After a long while of listening and many more specific questions, Lionel came to understand. His innate force node hadn't been planted into him. In fact, it was the exact opposite. Someone had operated on him as a child and taken it out. When Lionel wanted to find out more about this, the dictionary practically cut him out. The only understanding he managed to grasp was that it wasn't his father's family that had done so, and even that was only done through various deductions. Still, in the end, the innate force node was Lionel's to begin with. It was written into his very being. It just needed a catalyst to rebirth itself. In the end, that catalyst came much earlier than anyone could have ever expected. Finally, Lionel learned about just what this energy was. Ping! Scarlet Star Force. Lionel, who was still in a bit of a bad mood after learning he had been operated on without his knowledge as a child, raised his eyebrows. What is that force? Ping! Replying to Seed, Scarlet Star Force is a mutated light elemental force that has gained characteristics of fire elemental force and star elemental force. It's a balance of all three that creates an all-new energy that ranks among the top of all three elemental types. Oh, where does it rank amongst the three? Ping! It ranks top 10 of star elemental forces. It ranks top 3 within light elemental forces. It ranks number 1 within fire elemental forces. Lionel was shocked. This was the first time the dictionary had given him such a definitive answer about the strength of something. The fact its answer was so decisive and clear made Lionel realize that his Scarlet Star Force was likely something beyond his imagining. After taking several deep breaths to calm himself, Lionel asked the final question he had on his mind. What abilities is Scarlet Star Force known for? Ping! Destruction. Lionel plopped down on his bed, a hint of shock playing his features. It was a clean, direct, and unconfusing answer. It couldn't have been more forcefully outlined. And Lionel believed it with his very being. His Scarlet Star Force wasn't as simple as causing damage with oppressive heat or strong power. Lionel quite literally felt his cells quake whenever he observed the energy as though they didn't even want to live anymore. This level of force, this quality of energy, it held a mystery to it that was far beyond what the current Lionel could grasp. Even after just observing it for a moment, Lionel felt as though shackles within his mind were loosening. and the feeling was just as profound as the fourth-dimensional force art within his dream world. The only exception was that this Scarlet Star Force was only trying to teach him one thing instead of a myriad of things. How to destroy. Just when Lionel wanted to experiment to see what his true limits were, he froze, his gaze shooting up to the ceiling of his room. Someone was above him. Chapter 348. What is it, Uncle Zemo? Why did we stop? The voice of a young lady came out from the midst of an escort. In fact, it wasn't just any young lady, but rather Syl, the friend of the woman who was the cause of Lionel's current predicament, but also, ironically, maybe the reason Lionel was still alive. The escort was quite long, containing at least 50 individuals. Aside from one large chariot which Syl's voice came from, the rest rode odd war horses with twin horns, and an underbelly covered in thick scales. Uncle Zemo was the very same older man with sparse hair that had taken Syl away from Ree just days ago. But at the moment he stood in place at the head of the escort, his hands folded to his back and his gaze narrowed. The issue was that he seemed to be staring into empty space. Other than an unkempt road before him amidst a thick forest, there was nothing else. Just when everyone was beginning to think Uncle Zemo had gone crazy, the ground trembled slightly and a young man slowly appeared. For a moment, it seemed as though the whole of the world revolved around him. The young man wore heavy leather robes that exuded the wild air of a beast. His hair, shimmering of gold and bronze, swayed slightly beneath the wind, accentuating his sharp, handsome features. Though his eyes were colored a dull green, they held a hidden sharpness within them that remained calm even in the face of such a large group. It was clear that this young man was still in the third dimension. Anyone with internal sight could see the faint rejection of the world around him. Yet somehow, the pressure he exuded was so far beyond that. Uncle Zemo's gaze narrowed. "Is there a reason you called me out?" Lionel questioned. Despite the numerous eyes on him, his voice was steady and calm. However, it seemed to break an illusion everyone had just been under. Whether it was by coincidence or design, the aura of the previous Lionel had made everyone ignore a few things. For one, no one had noticed the little mink around his neck until now. And most importantly, no one had noticed the black mark that hovered before his forehead until now as well. Upon realizing this, Uncle Zemo's expression became more hostile than it already was, causing Lionel to frown. Lionel was getting really tired of people being hostile to him, just because of this mark on his forehead. He had even left the city, only for this nonsense to happen anyway. The worst part was that Lionel was certain that he was no match for this man. He didn't know enough about the fourth dimension to properly measure this man's stats, but all he needed to know was that this Uncle Zemo was far stronger than his previous self. As for how his current self would stack up, Lionel had no idea. He hadn't even had a chance to measure his limits. Uncle Zemo took a step forward, causing Lionel's furrowed brows to darken. "I suggest you watch yourself. I'm not in the greatest of moods," Lionel said coldly. "If you insist on attacking me without reason, I'll ensure that your whole escort is swarmed by beasts and invalids." Lionel's sudden words stunned Uncle Zemo. Maybe he had never expected someone within the third dimension to speak to him like this. There weren't many even within the fourth dimension who dared to say such words. However, Lionel was clearly not in the mood to mind his feelings. First he was branded like a slave. Then he was forced out of the city without a place to sleep. Then he almost died during his breakthrough, only to find out that someone had snatched something that was his as a child. Even though he had gotten it back now, with Lionel's personality, he was still more than just a little pissed. And now, instead of crossing over him without a word, this damned old man stopped the whole escort just to bring him out from the ground, and suddenly wanted to target him for something that wasn't his fault? Lionel found that his patience for nonsense was getting shorter and shorter as time passed. The longer he spent in this new world order, the more his charismatic, easygoing self was whittled away. Uncle Zemo's shocked appearance suddenly gave way to a sneer, and then laughter. It wasn't just him. Many of the soldiers and warriors within the escort couldn't hold it in any longer. Yet Lionel didn't seem to have heard their mocking chuckling. He flipped his palm over, a deep black bow appearing in his hand. Even the sun that peeked through the heavy foliage above could only be wholly absorbed by its surface. The little mink on Lionel's shoulder bared its little fangs, growling. Lionel's aura seemed to change once more, sharpening. A slightly cold wind circled around him, causing the dried leaves at his feet to swirl about. He casually knocked an arrow and faced the escort, his indifferent gaze locking onto Zemo. It was clear in an instant that he wasn't joking in the slightest. If this old man continued to piss him off, he really would do something. Uncle Zemo stopped laughing and frowned. Do you really think any beasts would be attracted by your mere third-dimensional force? Do you think I would need my fourth-dimensional force to deal with you? Do you think this is a fairy tale? Lionel's gaze remained without expression. It was as though he hadn't heard Zemo's words at all. His entire demeanor seemed to say, try me. His own third-dimensional force wouldn't attract invalids here. But what if he activated his Winter Four Seasons realm comprehension? He had already reached the pinnacle of crystallization. What if he broke into the fourth dimension with his soul force right here? And even if he ignored all of that, what about his Scarlet Star Force? Was there a beast or invalid in the world that could withstand its temptation? At this point, Lionel was truly daring Zemo to act. He would gladly bury this arrogant prick right here. At the same time, Uncle Zemo was growing more and more pissed. A mere third-dimensional ant actually dared to speak to him this way? The worst part was that he really didn't dare to call Lionel out on his bluff. Even if he truly believed Lionel was spewing nothing but nonsense, he had a responsibility to protect Zemo. Even if there was only a 1% chance, he was trained to not risk it. His gaze turned hard as he stared down Lionel, but the latter met his gaze without a worry. It's you. Suddenly, a voice cut through the atmosphere. Lionel frowned. Not only did he recognize the voice, just hearing it made him more pissed than he already was. At that moment, two women peeked out from the carriage, one of whom was Ree, the very woman who caused much of Lionel's troubles in this world. The moment she spoke, Lionel's glare landed on her, causing her trouble breathing to come back several folds stronger. She nearly collapsed where she stood. Uncle Zemo suddenly took a step forward, but, SHU. He had hardly moved when an arrow landed barely a centimeter before his foot. In that instant he froze. This wasn't because he felt the danger of the arrow. It was slow, and for someone like him, dodging it would have been possible. The issue was that he hadn't even finished lifting his foot when the arrow landed before him right in the area he had wanted to step toward. The awkward sudden stop shifted his momentum backward, causing an arrow that wouldn't have been lethal to him regardless to make him look ridiculous. Lionel's gaze left Ree and landed back on Uncle Zemo, his expression becoming even colder. Now that he knew this escort was led by that woman, his impression of them was even worse. Boy. Zemo's voice came out in a low growl. Uncle Zemo, stop. Syl's voice suddenly calmed the atmosphere once again. Young man, how about we have a chat? Lionel frowned and looked away from Zemo once again. What did this woman want? Chapter 349. Syl was a bit off-put by Lionel's reaction. What young man wouldn't want to have a talk with a beauty like her? What was his issue? However, with her noble upbringing, it was impossible for such thoughts to cross her face. In fact, they were just fleeting thoughts of hers she didn't spend much time on to begin with. Did you not hear her? Just when Lionel was thinking of what he should be doing, a young man riding one of those odd war steeds glared toward Lionel. It was clear that he was very much unsatisfied with Lionel's attitude. What the hell is wrong with these people? Lionel almost couldn't refrain from rolling his eyes. It was as though everyone who he met made it their duty to piss him off. If you want to speak with me, there's nothing wrong with the current arrangement. I would hate to get attacked again just for breathing the same air as you. Lionel said indifferently. Syl was even more stunned by these words, while Zemo's expression darkened. As for the young man who spoke out, his hand slid to the sword by his side. It seemed that he too was losing his patience. No one seemed to realize that Lionel's words were correct, even if they were somewhat rude. He had just been dragged up from deep within the earth, just because he happened to be along their way. Who knew what would happen if he actually accepted this advice? He didn't have a death wish. The only reason Lionel set himself up so close to the road to begin with was because beasts tended to avoid the human population, so they would be less likely to be near where humans frequented. But he didn't expect this logical choice to land him in trouble. Rhea stomped her feet. He's so rude, Sil. Just get Uncle Zimo to beat him up so we can leave. Lionel's gaze swept over Rhea once more, causing the rest of her words to get caught in her throat. Whatever she meant to say came out in a whimper, dying in her chest. Sil comforted Rhea for a moment before peeking back through the window of the carriage. She observed Lionel for a long while. She couldn't help but be curious, plus, she felt a bit guilty. She had happened to overhear some of the things Lionel had suffered through in the city thanks to the actions of her friend. The fact he was hostile wasn't too much of a surprise. It could even be said it was partly her fault for giving Rhea an inside path toward a job she wasn't qualified for. Sil hesitated. I'm in need of a guard. The pay is quite good if you're interested. Zimo's expression changed. Guard? What better guard was there than him? Even if he failed, there were still 50 others. And even if those 50 failed, there were still the hand-selected youths for this important event. And, even if by some act of a god all of this failed, there were still the life-saving measures she had as the young miss of a preeminent family. What need did she have for a third-dimensional guard? The young man riding the war horse by Sil's carriage carried the worst expression. How did asking for a new guard reflect on himself? But Lionel's words made it all worse. I have no interest in being a bodyguard. I only want to leave this place without being targeted. Lionel said plainly. Though he was in need of an organization to gain information from, Lionel had no interest in this nonsense. He had to figure out a way to find Aina, or at least get her to find him, and joining a group with so much clear hostility toward him was the last thing he wanted to do. Sil was once again stumped. She tried to be nice, but if Lionel didn't want it, there was no way for her to force him to accept her kindness. Of course, if Lionel knew her thoughts, he would think she thought too much of herself. It was an act of kindness for him to act as her guard? Compared to those here, even if his physical strength couldn't match up, his internal sight was most definitely unmatched. His ability to keep her safe by avoiding danger alone would be better than everyone here. Even if it wasn't about his internal sight, Lionel was starting to get a better and better understanding of his talent, and how it matched up to others the longer he spent in this new world order. Maybe in a time as short as a month, Sil wouldn't have the face to ask him for such a thing. After a moment of being flustered, Sil still didn't know how to respond. It was then that something no one could have expected to happen, happened. Zyler, your quota is revoked. Young man, I would like for you to take his place in representing Outkiafer family. What do you think? The young man riding the odd-scaled war horse froze. All the animosity and hatred he had on his face was suddenly washed away by despair. The delicate voice sounded from within the carriage. Though Lionel couldn't see who had spoken, he felt as though her words manifested into a painting of her image. It was gorgeous, pure and flawless, riding the cool wind like a fragrant breeze. Lionel didn't know why, but he was compelled to say yes almost immediately. However, everyone else was shocked beyond belief. Let alone Zyler. Even Sil, who had wanted to take Lionel as a bodyguard, and Zimo, who had wanted to kill Lionel just a moment ago, stood frozen. Lionel might not have known who had just spoken, but they knew well who it was. She was none other than the future matriarch of the family, the woman both Rhea and Sil called sister-in-law, and the wife of Sil's only elder brother, Mistress Era. Compared to Sil, the word of this woman was practically law. Since she had spoken, things were practically final. It was to the point where even if Lionel wanted to run, Zimo wouldn't allow him to. In fact, it was to the point that any hostility Zimo had toward Lionel could only be buried deep within his heart. Realizing the sudden change in the atmosphere, Lionel seemed to understand that turning this offer down wasn't an option. But what was this quota this woman spoke of? What mess had he been thrust into this time? Chapter 350. Lionel sat in the carriage completely expressionless, as though he couldn't sense the numerous glares coming at him from the outside. The truth was that if he was a bit less thick-skinned, he would be embarrassed as well. He was currently the only man within the carriage, and the reason for this was quite embarrassing as well. He really hated riding horses. Lionel sat in a corner to himself, ignoring the fragrance that hung in the air. He had never been very moved by such things to begin with. Even the beautiful Mistress Era only caught his attention for a moment before he didn't glance her way again. Indeed, she was quite beautiful. In fact, it seemed that Lionel would meet a new most beautiful woman he had ever seen every other month. It was as though they all grew on trees and were being picked for him in terms of quality. But Lionel knew that the truth was that the more powerful the woman, the more beautiful they seemed to be. This was likely just a matter of evolution. Era, though, seemed to be particularly fairy-like. A head of flowing white hair, two crystal-like, shimmering blue eyes, a delicately sculpted nose. Everything down from the slight blush of her cheeks to the slenderness of her fingers were all perfectly sculpted to enrapture a man. It somehow made Lionel think of Aina, not for their similarities, but for their differences. Lionel's memory of Aina wasn't as beautiful. In fact, even when Aina wore dresses and portrayed the image of a shy, reserved lady, he had always noticed her tan skin. Of course, on Earth, women took tanning as a trend, at least in the western parts of the world. This was a trend that held strong from the 21st century even to this current point. But Lionel knew that Aina wasn't the type of person to artificially tan herself or lounge out in the sun. Subconsciously, he always knew that her tan must have come from something else. In fact, it was precisely because of Aina's tan that Lionel first became interested in her, and his curiosity eventually got the best of him. Lost in thought, Lionel suddenly smiled. It seemed he missed her quite a lot. He longed to fight side by side with her again. Those warriors who caught sight of Lionel's smile through the window were stunned before feeling furious again, especially when they saw that Ri and Sil had entered somewhat of a daze. Lionel didn't seem to notice the reactions of the others around him as he closed his eyes, entering a state of meditation as he allowed the little mink to cuddle in his arms. At that moment, it seemed as though the air around him had subtly changed. Though he wanted to ask about what he had just gotten himself into, since Mistress Era hadn't said a word, he could only remain silent as well. With his dream world, he could still improve himself without moving an inch. As Lionel fell into meditation, Ri looked somewhat jealously toward the little mink in his arms, causing Sil to giggle. For someone who claims to be scared of him, you sure interact with him a lot, she said teasingly. Ri pouted. I just wanted to pet it. Why couldn't I just pet it? Little Blackstar opened one of its eyes to look at Ri before closing it, and ignoring her once again. This disregard almost made her stamp her foot in rage. Era remained silent throughout the antics of the two girls, sending a curious gaze toward Lionel. Interesting, she thought, smiling to herself. Lionel's mind fully entered his dream world. At the moment, he could split his mind 9 ways, so he put one to the task of monitoring the surroundings of his main body while the rest immersed themselves. I've mastered 300 spears to now. If I want to completely grasp the chain domain, I still have 1,700 more to go. Lionel sighed. It took him months to reach that 300 or so spear mark. It would probably take him years to finish comprehending just a singular spear domain. Yet that wasn't even a single % of the spears within the spear domain ring. If only I could break through now. Lionel knew that his ability was directly tied to his soul force. If he broke through to the 4th dimension with it, his ability would definitely evolve to an all-new level. But it was simply too dangerous to do this in the wilderness. This was the real reason Lionel swallowed all of that dew in one go previously. He didn't want to risk running out of force and having to pull from the atmosphere. If he did, he would have probably been swarmed and died. Unfortunately, he had no dew left. And even if he did, the dew wasn't compatible with his soul force as it was normal force. In addition, it was only of the 3rd dimension, not the 4th, so it was completely unhelpful. Lionel shook his head. If he hadn't been kicked out of the city, this wouldn't have been a problem. But life wasn't fair. Maybe I should just try to dream sculpt those 4 seasons force arts? Lionel rejected this idea immediately. He would need to bring them out from the snow globes in order to do this. Someone as sharp as Era would definitely see through their specialness. By then, it'd be a wonder if he could even keep them. Lionel wasn't foolish enough to simply believe Era was a good person just because she was beautiful and had a pleasing voice. Then it seems my only option is to focus on comprehending the changes to my body and comprehending more spears. Lionel shook his head. There were really too many things limiting him. Wait. Lionel's gaze suddenly sharpened. He looked up toward the very top of his dream world, locking eyes with a massive sphere of force arts. With a thought, a spear manifested in Lionel's hands. It was adorned by feathers and seemed quite light to the touch. In addition, it was wildly flexible, waving about at the slightest movement of Lionel's wrist. It felt more like a loose string or a whip than a spear. This was one of the spears that Lionel had yet to master. Lionel locked eyes with the spherical force art, and suddenly brandished the spear. He instantly fell into a state of enlightenment. What he didn't know was that at the very instant he did, Era's gaze suddenly shot open like an eagle. The air around Lionel had changed once again. Auspicious air? Chapter 351. Auspicious air. Ancient aura. Heavenly enlightenment. It went by many names across just as many worlds. But regardless of what it was called, the rarity of it didn't change at all. Even the normally calm and unflustered Era couldn't help but be shocked at this moment. It was to the point her eyes widened uncontrollably. Sist. Era raised her slender finger to her pink lips, shushing Syl. It seemed that she was afraid of waking Lionel from such a rare state. It was clear that she had no idea that Lionel had entered this state by choice, and it wasn't a mere rare chance. It was something beyond that. A few minutes later, the air around Lionel suddenly vanished, and he woke up within his dream world. At that moment, he too was stunned. 3 minutes. It took 3 minutes. Lionel was shocked. Usually, it would take him a few hours to master a spear if he went all out. In truth, this was already shockingly fast. If others came to know he could do this, there was no telling what kind of sensation it would cause. However, Lionel came to realize that as he climbed the hill, the more difficult it became and the more hours he had to pour in to master these spears. Before he realized it, a few months had passed and he had only mastered 300 or so of the over 2,000 he needed to. But this took him only 3 minutes. The most shocking part was that he had only comprehended with one mind. What if he split his mind 8 ways and reflected on the force art from 8 different directions at once? Era sighed. It only lasted a few minutes, but that would be enough for him to meditate on for a lifetime. He's quite a lucky child. Era almost choked. Lionel entered the state again. Her elegant demeanor was suddenly thrust out the window. Lionel began to experiment. Would it be more efficient to comprehend numerous spells at once? Or meditate on the same spear? What about if he spent 4 mind splits on one spear and 4 on another? What if he spent 2 on each spear? Lionel exhausted all these options, hopping into and out of a state Era thought was nearly impossible to touch in the first place. By the end of it all, she felt so numb that she may very well have been close to losing her mind. Syl and Ree watched this scene play out from the side, completely stunned. They didn't know what had happened to their elegant and refined sister-in-law to make her act like this. In truth, Era's reactions weren't very exaggerated. To other people, they could only be considered to be a slight reaction. Maybe a slight opening of her pink lips, a slight raise of her brows, a slight twitch at the corner of her eyes and lashes. However, for Era, this was the equivalent of her jaw dropping to the floor. Of course, Lionel had no idea what these women were feeling. He wouldn't care even if he knew. After all, the force art was within his dream world, which was essentially just a projection of his memories in his mind. It was impossible for anyone to take from him. Is this his ability? Era finally concluded. When Era came to this conclusion, she sucked in a cold breath. She suddenly understood why Lionel would disdain to be a bodyguard. Though Era had already seen through Lionel's potential, it seemed that even her own evaluation was too low. Someone with such an ability wouldn't be restricted by anything. Of course, Era was technically incorrect, but also could be considered to be correct in a way as well. Without his ability, it would truly be impossible for Lionel to do what he was doing now. If this is truly the case, we have picked up a treasure. But this treasure will be difficult to control. Mistress Era regained her calm. No matter how one looked, It had become impossible to read her thoughts from her expression. So that's how things are. Lionel realized several things through countless experiments. For one, it was far more efficient to split his mind and meditate on the same spear. From Lionel's trials, for a spear at the bottom of the hill, it took about a single minute to master while meditating on the natural force art. For one nearer the middle, it took about 5 minutes. For one near the top, it took upwards of 10 minutes. However, if he meditated on a spear with 2 minds at once, the time was lowered by a factor of 3. A lower tier spear would take 20 seconds and so on. The more minds Lionel used, the efficiency became greater and greater. Eventually, when he used all 8 minds, it took him no more than a second or 2 for a lower tier spear, and not even a third of a minute for a higher tier one. Still, even this wasn't the greatest realization Lionel had made. When he went back to the base of the spear peak in order to experiment with lower tier spears, he realized that masteries could be separated into tiers. Lionel personally chose to split masteries into 2 tiers. One, the lower, was what he called shallow mastery, while the higher was named depth mastery by him. Shallow mastery was all Lionel had grasped until now. In order to evoke this mastery, he had to recall the memories and project the image of the spear consciousness outward. This was why whenever he battled with his spear, the images of the spear owners would pop up. However, when he reached depth mastery, this evocation was no longer necessary. It became ingrained into his very bones. In order to reach depth mastery, the requirement was 10 times the time. This meant for a lower level spear, it would take about 20 seconds. For a middle level spear, it would around 2 minutes. For a higher tier spear, it would take around 4 to 5 minutes. But for Lionel, this was well worth it because he realized that when he reached depth mastery, the stamina it took him to use his dreamscape battle sense plummeted. Chapter 352. Lionel lost track of the days, causing the ladies within the carriage to almost become worried. This wasn't because they were worried for Lionel, and it wasn't because they were worried about their own safety having to sleep in the same region as a man either. After all, with Mistress Era here, even if Lionel had evil thoughts, whether or not he'd be able to keep his life for more than a few seconds was the real question in such a situation. What they were really worried about was cleanliness. They were very much worried that Lionel would ruin things with his presence. And as though this wasn't bad enough, he hadn't moved in almost a week already. But as time passed, they began to realize something extraordinary. Despite not making any attempts to clean himself, Lionel actually didn't smell. In fact, he looked the exact same as he had when he began to meditate without a care in the world. Not only that, but he didn't even try to strike up a conversation with any one of them. It made sense for him to maintain distance from Era. After all, considering how much Syl's elder brother doted on his wife, he might very well kill Lionel just for being in her presence like this. But what about Rhea and Syl? The two women began to feel that there was either something wrong with them, or something wrong with Lionel. Lionel's eyes suddenly shot open. A piercing gaze seemed to tear through the air before him as the faint light of a spear shot into the void. Mistress Era didn't miss this subtle change. But before she needed to act, Lionel snuffed out the aura himself. Lionel sent his gaze out of the carriage window, finding an ever-looming city quickly approaching. But this city made the one he had landed in seem like a children's toy. Its walls were hundreds of meters tall, projecting an air of not only strength but also artistry. Lionel never thought that he'd be thinking such a thing about wall, but here he was. The walls were a gentle gold color accented by a strong crimson red. Depictions of valiant warriors and magical beasts were etched across its surface, projecting a 3-dimensional landscape of war. Just staring at the images made Lionel feel as though the clanging of weapons and the roaring of beasts were reverberating in his mind. Yet he couldn't take his eyes off of it. He felt his blood boil, his eyes flickering on and off with a violet-red color that shrouded the carriage in an oppressive air. This feeling. It was the very same feeling he had the first time he faced an army of demons. Syl and Rhea shivered, inching away from Lionel while lamenting that the massive carriage was still too small. Mistress Era's gaze trembled. She too felt her heart palpitate. She could tell that this was the first time Lionel was seeing these walls. Usually, it was impossible to become so immersed during a second or third attempt. In addition, most would miss the opportunity and look away after losing courage, not knowing they were leaving an opportunity of a lifetime behind. Era could have never expected that Lionel would not only keep looking, but he had even awoken from his meditation as though he had sensed it calling out to him. This has no business on a fourth-dimensional world. Lionel suddenly mumbled. The words were only meant for himself, but Era's eyes widened when she managed to grasp them. In the end, she smiled lightly. Though she did with her demeanor, it was no more than the slightest curl of her lip. Lionel, you are quite patient. All this time, you haven't asked what it is you'll be participating in. Lionel blinked out of his thoughts and looked toward the future matriarch of the Kiefer family. This was the first time she had spoken with him since he entered this carriage. I figured you'd tell me when it was time. Lionel finally replied. Era's beautiful blue eyes fluttered. Then, without responding directly to the question, she looked toward the city in the distance. Do you know what that city represents? Bravery. Lionel said without hesitation. Era seemed surprised by this answer before she smiled lightly. This time, her smile seemed much more obvious than it had been in the past. That's one answer, she said non-committedly. My answer, though, is even simpler than that. It's survival. Lionel's heart stilled for a moment. A flood of unknowable emotions surged through him, causing his blood to rumble once more. You say bravery because you have the strength to say as much. To those without power, it's never about something so idealistic. All they want to see is their next day, their next meal, their next breath. It's not about anything more than that. Syl's eyes glittered as she looked toward Lionel. Is this boy really powerful enough to gain such an evaluation from her sister-in-law? As for the simplest among them all, she almost couldn't refrain from harumphing. She clearly didn't like anything that praised Lionel. What powerful man would bully a young, beautiful girl like her? More pointedly, what powerful man would have such a slave brand? Lionel didn't respond to these words. This wasn't the first time he had run into such a problem. His talk with Roaring Black Lion all those months ago still resurfaced in his memories from time to time. You could say that this is a matter of survival for our family. So, I hope that you'll treat this with the appropriate amount of seriousness. It was only now Lionel realized that he was dealing with a mad woman. This woman knew nothing about him. Yet, she directly snubbed a genius likely handpicked by their family in favor of him. A man branded with a mark that might as well have assigned him as a slave. If she wasn't mad, then how else would you describe it? Yet Lionel couldn't help but find himself grinning. If he couldn't find Aina, the next best option was to raise holy hell until she caught wind of him being here. If this place was really so important, wouldn't it be perfect for him? He was beginning to think that Era might have taken a liking to him because he too was a madman. Chapter 353. That's the Kefir family's entourage. The outside of the valiant city was bustling. It was not much different from the people of Earth meeting their celebrities. To the common folk, a family that ruled of a city like Kefir's was far beyond their reach. To see them in the flesh like this was an opportunity of a lifetime. These people knew that they would never have the chance to enter Brave City, but they still traveled here from all over just to catch a glimpse of the festivities. The best part was that they could do so safely. No beasts or invalids would dare to enter even the 10-kilometer radius of Brave City. The aura around it was simply too oppressive. Thanks to this, it was often even safer to be here than it would be to stay at their homes. The Swan family escort is here. The crowd boiled once again. What could excite the people more if not rivalry and competition? Not only were the Swan and Kiefer families both long-standing enemies, but they also both had the strength to stand out amidst the crowd. Terrain had a system of cities and powers. They worked together to balance one another. While the cities were ruled by city lords, the powers were ruled by patriarchs and matriarchs. Of course, there were divisions amongst cities and within powers. But both Kefir and Swan City were both the highest Tier 9 cities. They stood at the helm of the world along with the strongest powers. If not, they would never have teleportation hubs. The warriors of the Swan and Kefir families swept glances over one another. a haughty air exuding from them all. They seemed to toe a line of acknowledgement and indifference. Both entourages came to a stop about half a kilometer from the looming city gates. Even as members of the escort, they were aware that they wouldn't be allowed to enter the city gates. Only the elites amongst the elite would be allowed to do such a thing. At that moment, the crowd became entirely focused on the carriages near the middle of the entourage, and the small group of elites around it. They all knew that the group of young men and women around the center, and the elites within the carriage were the only ones that would be able to take the stage. At that moment, Zyler's expression was gloomy as could be. He gripped the reins of his war horse so tightly that the imprint seeped into his skin, and even became soaked with blood. Those who had gained a quota along with Zyler looked toward him with pitying gazes, and couldn't help but push their hatred for Lionel up another notch. This adulation should have been Zyler's. Yet he wouldn't even get to participate in something he had worked so hard for. How could he also not be enraged? But in a world where power spoke over all, there was nothing he could do. Mistress Era was more powerful than he was, so her word was final. Nothing more, nothing less. At that moment, the door to the Swan family's carriage opened. The first to step out was a young woman. Her demeanor and elegance was a step below that of Mistress Era. However, her looks were not in the least bit inferior. Her charm lay in her openness. She wore a modest blue dress that matched well with her deep black hair and fair complexion. A perpetual, inviting smile hung from her lips, capturing the hearts of all those who saw her. The moment this young woman stepped out, 8 youths riding war horses of their own stepped down from them, following to her back in an orderly fashion. Young Miss Swan. The crowd seemed to be breathless for a moment. Just as the atmosphere was reaching its peak, the Kiefer family carriage opened. Syl descended with a bright smile. She didn't look directly at the crowd, but it still felt as though she had greeted them all one by one. She was nothing like the flustered young lady, who didn't know how to respond to Lionel's bluntness, and played every bit the part of elegant noble woman. Her charisma was no less than young Miss Swan. In fact, since she picked up some tips from her own sister-in-law, her own demeanor was even slightly more refined than the latter. However, it was at that instant that something no one could have possibly expected to happen occurred. Another person stepped out from the carriage, but his appearance came with what sounded like the shattering of countless hearts. The moment the young man appeared, it was as though a spear had suddenly been brandished before the world. A sharpening blade resonated in the ears of all those who saw him, causing the air to grow several times heavier. The young man's almost golden hair swayed gently beneath his billowing aura, a faint violet hue collecting around him like a cloud. It felt as though his immediate surroundings had become his inescapable domain, a place he controlled all to his own. For those moments, he overshadowed Syl completely. Thoughts that he wasn't worthy to stand by her side didn't even have a chance to manifest before they were ruthlessly crushed. It was to the point that no one even noticed the black brand between his brows. At that moment, let alone those watching on, even Syl was stunned. Was this the same young man who had sat quietly within their carriage for so long? The same young man who had entered their city in rags? The legs of the war horses around Lionel trembled, causing some of the riders to almost fall off completely. Zemo's eyes narrowed. At that moment, he admonished himself for ever doubting the judgment of the mistress. Lionel swept a gaze over the crowd. He knew that in order to catch Aina's attention, he had to stand out as much as possible. He no longer bothered to restrain his aura, nor did he feign his usual modesty. Since he was here, he would make sure his name resounded throughout terrain. At that moment, even the elegant young Miss Swan couldn't help but look toward him with a hint of shock and curiosity in her eyes. Then, she swept a glance toward Syl with a teasing expression. Within the carriage, Era was holding back a pouting Ree who was clearly dissatisfied by the fact she wasn't allowed to go. Sister-in-law, I want to go too. Era shook her head. You can enter the spectator stands with me later. You won't be able to enter the gates the normal way regardless. Though Era spoke these words to appease Ree, it was clear that she was absent-minded. Her gaze glistened as she watched Lionel's back through the curtains of the carriage. She felt that this was the true Lionel. But if that was the case, it'd be even more difficult to control than she thought. Still, he was a bit too naive. Regardless of what reasons he had for showing off his sharpness now, he was already being slowly ensnared by her. Looking toward her little sister-in-law's blushing face, as she gazed toward Lionel who had suddenly appeared to her side, Era's slight smile appeared once again. Chapter 354. Lionel's aura blazed like the sun. Somehow, even with a beauty like Syl standing by him, she was the one who was overshadowed. Who is that? The crowd had fallen into a temporary silence before they suddenly erupted with discussion. Am I seeing things? Did the Kefir family marry my goddess away? In the minds of those on terrain, the only reason a male could be sharing a carriage like this with the younger sister of the Kefir family heir could only be this. These big families cared too much about their reputation to allow even an inkling of rumors to start without adequate cause. This meant that even if these two weren't betrothed now, it wouldn't be long before they were. Of all those here, Syl seemed to be the one who understood this the most clearly, especially after she realized her sister-in-law was actually blocking Rhi from exiting the carriage. Even if Rhi's appearance wouldn't completely quell the rumors, it would at least calm some of the heat she was feeling now. Lionel, however, seemed oblivious to all of this. He took a step forward, his gaze sweeping over the youths who had descended from their war horses. He could easily sense the hostility in their eyes. But surprisingly, Xyler, who should feel the most wronged, was silent and refused to meet his eyes. I can tell that you all are unsatisfied. Syl blinked, not expecting Lionel to be so direct. The version of Lionel she knew was closed off and restrained. She had no idea that this wasn't the real Lionel. Lionel wasn't a cold or arrogant person. He liked to think of himself as social and lively. But circumstances seemed to constantly be pushing his true self away. Hearing Lionel's words, as though they held some compelling spell to them, the youths who were glaring at him still couldn't help but listen. And though I know you all don't want to hear it, I'm sure you also understand that it wasn't my choice to be here either, right? Xyler clenched his fists. Hey, watch your words. A petite young woman stepped toward Lionel. Clearly she didn't like Lionel's words. What worse thing was there to hear after losing something that the person who got it didn't even appreciate it? In some ways, that felt worse than said person just gloating. That said, how could Lionel not understand this? He swept a glance toward the petite young woman, causing her next words to get caught in her throat. For whatever reason, beneath Lionel's direct gaze, she couldn't seem to muster up any courage to continue her tirade. I don't say this to belittle Xyler. I say this so that we can get an understanding of one another. Those were simply my feelings in the past. Now that I've seen those city gates and laid eyes on the war scenes it depicts. Lionel's hair billowed beneath his aura, his eyes blazing like two torches. He couldn't help but grin, the rushing of his blood sounding like crashing waterfalls in his ears. I have not a single intention of giving my spot up. Lionel's almost fiendish grin caused the petite woman to stumble. You Seven and Syl are my teammates. I hope that instead of letting animosity get the best of you, you'll realize that sabotaging me is the very same as disrespecting Xyler. The young woman and the others were stunned. That was right, if they could get enraged simply because Lionel said that he didn't want the position to begin with. How much worse would it be to ruin the opportunity he had? Suddenly, the petite young woman felt as though she had fallen into a trap she couldn't get out of. Lionel smiled. Let's go. Lionel turned toward the gates. Despite the fact they were half a kilometer away, it felt as though they were bearing down on him. This level of majesty was far beyond anything he had seen in his lifetime before. Syl and the others subconsciously followed his steps, not realizing their actions until Lionel suddenly stopped and looked back toward Xyler. Xyler stood with his fists clenched, looking toward their backs as blood trickled between his fingers. He was the first person to not avoid Lionel's gaze when he met them. Second place was never an option for me, Lionel said plainly. At first, it sounded as though Lionel was leaving behind some scolding words for Xyler. However, what Xyler heard was completely different. What he heard was a promise. Syl blinked, not really believing what she was seeing. How did he rein in these arrogant geniuses? Even she could hardly do it, and that was only because of her family background, while the other half of the reason was because they wanted to marry her. Plus, How did she suddenly become a background character? Before she could realize what was happening, their group had caught up to the Swan families. Lionel stood at the helm with Syl by his side. Young Miss Swan stood at the forefront of her own group, looking toward them curiously. All of them stood at the demarcation line. Those without talent didn't dare to cross this 500-meter mark from the brave city gates. If they dared to do so, they would only be asking for death. Young Miss Swan blinked. "Is this your man, little Syl? He's quite good. I'm a little bit jealous." Lionel pretended as though he hadn't heard anything, but Syl suddenly became flushed. The men within young Miss Swan's group stared daggers toward Lionel. It seemed they didn't quite like that their goddess was praising another man. A particular large one amongst them, standing a head taller than even the already tall Lionel, shot an aura of competition toward him. Lionel planned to ignore this and take the first step forward, however. It was then that a rush surged through the crowd once again. It seemed that another city lord power had appeared. Chapter 355. The Black City Escort. This city seemed to take their name quite seriously. Their war steeds were a deep shade of night with a singular jagged horn gracing their foreheads. Their carriage seemed carved of carbon, and an oppressive aura hung over them all. Bang! The carriage doors opened. The first thing anyone saw was a heavily armored leg smashing against the ground. Lionel could tell that if it wasn't for the fact this was a fourth-dimensional world, the ground would have been cracked beyond repair. But even then, the weight of this man was undeniable. And when he came into view, his oppressive presence seemed to overshadow all things. The man's beard could only be described as furious. It ran across his face and jaw like the blades of a knife. It was objectively unkempt. But if the man groomed it, something would feel off, as though this was his natural state. The state of the man's face made it hard to tell his age. But those with sharp senses could tell that he was also a youth. His heavy black armor clinked about as he walked. Without having to say a word, 8 followed him in tow, soon reaching the demarcation line as well. At that moment, the young man grinned, seeing the 2 beauties. Lucky, lucky. I was assigned to the same entrance as 2 beauties. Syl and young Miss Swan looked toward this young man with a hint of disgust and trepidation in their eyes. It was clear to them that Lionel was far more pleasing to the eye, especially since, other than his odd beard, this young man's head reflected the sun about as well as a polished mirror. That said, considering his status, his bald head had never gotten in his way of wooing women. So why would he care? At that moment, the little mink around Lionel's shoulder snickered. It seemed that Minnie had missed its presence, just like Minnie hadn't noticed the brand between Lionel's brows. When the man heard this, it looked toward Lionel and found the little mink, causing his eyes to glow. He could sense something he deeply liked within the body of this little mink. "I want your beast," he suddenly said. The little mink hopped to Lionel's head, wrapping around itself and yawning. The appearance of its little pink tongue made it seem as though it wasn't worried about the black-armored, bald man at all. Lionel swept a glance toward the black-armored man. There was a reason he had waited here, and it definitely wasn't out of respect for this man. Achievements were only worth something if others didn't achieve. There would be no happiness if there was no sadness, no joy if there was no despair. The more people there were to act as a contrast to him, the better. The black-armored man could tell that despite the fact Lionel had to look up, he wasn't oppressed by his aura in the slightest. However, unlike everyone else who had been starstruck by Lionel's appearance, the black-armored man was, likewise, not. "Life's unfair," Lionel said plainly. "Unfortunately, you can't always have what you want." Hearing Lionel's words, the young man was stunned for a moment before suddenly grinning fiendishly. "Slave brand. 3rd dimension. Little pretty gigolo. I never thought that someone like this would actually dare to speak to me in this way." The man's words were like a bomb going off in the crowd. Everyone had been so overwhelmed by Lionel's presence that they hardly dared to observe him closely. It was only after hearing these things that they suddenly realized that the black-armored man was correct. Lionel's lip curled, but the smile held a hint of coldness to it. He actually didn't mind the man saying such words. Sometimes, infamy was the best form of fame. However, Lionel still marked this man as one that needed to be taught a lesson. Now he just had the perfect excuse to do so. Seeing Lionel's unperturbed smile, the black armored man felt some discomfort. It seems we have something in common, Lionel said lightly. Before, no one dared to speak to me in this way either. It was only after the world began to change that some gained an overinflated sense of self-importance. It seems like you're another one of them. How about we make a bet? The smile within Lionel's gaze deepened. I don't have any words as pointed as gigolo to call you, but what do you say, Baldy? The man's gaze narrowed as a silence fell over the crowd. It seems you want to die. His voice became like gravel as his aura bore down on Lionel. Do you accept, or not, Baldy? Lionel replied. The man stared toward Lionel before bursting out into a fit of laughter. When he finally stopped, his aura had become as heavy as a mountain, bearing down on everyone present. Whether it was his love of women or his want for the little mink, he forgot about them all in that very instant. What is this bet? If the stakes are too small, I just might take your life right here and now. Isn't there a trial right before us now? Lionel said plainly. I'll not only outperform you, I'll embarrass you. As for the stakes, do you dare to bet your life? Maybe it was because the valiant aura of the brave city gates was fueling his raging blood. Or maybe it was because Lionel was going all out to stand out as much as possible. But whatever the truth was, a bloodthirsty and cold presence seemed to exude from him. The man faltered slightly. Then, he seemed to truly see Lionel for the first time. I, Jeffrack Black, have never stepped down from any challenge. Good. Lionel replied plainly. Lionel took a step forward and crossed the line. As though a beast was roaring in his face, his hair whipped back violently, his face even distorting slightly. Since you've reported your name, I'll do the same. I'm Lionel Morales. Remember it well. Chapter 356. Still panicked. The first reason was Lionel's crazy challenge, and the second reason was the little mink. Lionel was still in the third dimension while Jeffrack had long since entered the fourth. On top of that, there was no way the little mink could withstand the pressure of Brave City. She had been so distracted before that she hadn't remembered the little beast until Jeffrack mentioned it. Now that she had, she couldn't help but close her eyes, not wanting to watch such an innocent little beast die like this. However, even with her eyes closed and several seconds ticking by, the sounds she expected to hear never reached her ears. Everyone watched in shock as Lionel took one step after another. It seemed as though the pressure couldn't do much more to him than kick up a strong wind. As for the little mink, it growled a bit. But afterward, its body exuded a slight black fog. Soon, it was sleeping again as though nothing had happened. At that moment, Lionel turned back toward their group. Aren't you all coming? Lionel asked. With that, Lionel continued forward. In his sights, the looming walls bore down on him as though trying to crush his will. Syl grit her teeth and took a step forward as well. The instant she did, she felt her knees buckle for a moment before they straightened. As though her actions were a cue, the youths began to move as one, their actions the subject of great entertainment for the surrounding crowd that didn't dare to follow. Jeffrack, too, took a heavy step forward, plowing through the pressure until he matched up to Lionel's speed. His gaze didn't leave Lionel's side profile, as though he was waiting for the latter to collapse. Since he had accepted the bet, he wouldn't attack Lionel now. However, the moment Lionel showed any signs of collapsing, he would strike him dead. No one, not even his own brothers, would dare to talk to him in the way Lionel had. And this arrogant prick actually dared to report his name right after his? He really wanted to see how far a third-dimensional ant could go. At that moment, across the 8 gates of Brave City, similar competitions were happening all over. The fervor of the crowds in these locations were no less. However, the location of the Swan, Kiefer and Black families was still among the most heated. How could it not be if a bet to the death was taking place? However, the quick conclusion many were expecting never came. Lionel's steps remained steady. In fact, it seemed as though he had forgotten all about the world around him. He continued to stare intently at the gates before him, the images of battle being firmly ingrained into his mind. He lost himself in his focus, causing a familiar aura to billow out from around him. Jeffrack felt his heart seize when he felt it. To a genius like him, making it to the gates was an easy task. He was leisurely strolling just like Lionel was. They both knew that the true distinguishing factors would only make themselves known at the gates themselves. However, feeling such an aura, Jeffrey's steps faltered. He even felt that the pressure coming from Lionel was a step more forceful than even the brave city gates. Soon the group separated. In the very front, there was Lionel and Jeffrey. A step behind them were young Miss Swan and Syl. And much further behind them were the petite young woman and the other lackeys of the city lord Powers. Who is he? Young Miss Swan looked toward Syl with curious, blinking eyes. A delicate sweat covered her elegant brow. But rather than destroying her demeanor, it made her look more pitiable. She played the role of vulnerable princess in need of saving exceptionally well. It was clear that the two women could be walking side by side with Lionel and Jeffrey should they want to. However, there was no need to enter a big dick contest between men. Whether they reached the gates first or last, it wouldn't make much of a difference as long as they did so within the allotted time. Realizing this, why would young Miss Swan not take the opportunity to learn a bit more about this mysterious Lionel character? Syl blinked innocently, a beautiful smile crossing her soft pink lips. None of your business. The two women walked side by side, smiling amicably. Yet the atmosphere was deathly cold. Maybe this was the hypocrisy of women. They too were having their own big dick contest. It was just more covert. At that moment, Jeffrey was still observing Lionel. Maybe due to the influence of the brave city gates, but he was the only one who could sense this oppressive aura coming from Lionel. He seemed to realize this as well, judging by the reactions of everyone else, so he bit down hard on his tongue so as not to lose face. However, Lionel couldn't be bothered to deal with him. A huge chunk of herb or suddenly appeared in his hand. This pressure makes it easier to absorb the herb essence. Thanks to his breakthrough, Lionel was already within the superior stage. At this level, his body was already comparable to a weak pseudo-fourth dimension metal, and he was only a stage away from perfection. Disregard. Lionel had already gotten his use out of Jeffrey. What happened from here on out between them didn't matter to him as long as he beat him. Jeffrey seemed to sense this as well, and it lit a fire in his chest. However, no amount of his anger seemed to change a single thing. For entities as strong as them, it should have only taken less than a minute to cross 500 meters. Yet, under the pressure, it took them a half hour. When the gates became clear, everyone seemed to understand that this was where the true trial began. The doors loomed to an impossibly tall height. Standing beneath them, Lionel could only lift his head vertically. And even then, it was hard to see the tops of the walls. However, it was these very doors they needed to push to enter. Chapter 357. Jeffrey was drenched in sweat. In order not to lose face, he had kept up with Lionel's pace from start to finish. But the result made his lungs scream. Unfortunately, the pressure of the gates had nothing to do with strength. Even a fifth-dimensional entity would face a proportional amount of pressure. This was, of course, the same for Jeffrey. But what Jeffrey couldn't believe was that Lionel seemed unaffected, let alone breathing as heavily as him. Lionel didn't even seem as though he had sweated a single drop. To make matters worse, Jeffrey was certain that the reason he was in such a sorry state was because of the pressure of the wall, but rather because of the pressure from Lionel himself. Finally, for the first time since their competition began, Lionel looked toward Jeffrey. "You don't look too good, Baldy. You doing okay?" Jeffrey's gaze flashed with a bloody red. He glared at Lionel, his chest heaving. At that moment, from atop the city walls, a few individuals looked down with curiosity. They all seemed like youths as well. However, whether they had gone through the same trials or not was unknown. "Isn't that Black City's bald boy? He looks like he's in a pretty sorry state. What happened to him?" The few on the wall chuckled. However, let alone hearing them, those below couldn't even see them. It was as though they were in a completely different world. The only one who frowned, seemingly realizing something was off, was Lionel. However, even with his senses, he had no way of seeing through the brave city barrier. He only felt a faint itching at the small of his back, as though he was being watched. Which door do you think they'll be able to open? PFT, aren't you just wondering if we'll have any competition? Regardless, if they're anything below Royal ITL'll be too much of a disappointment. If that was the case, I would have gotten up to come all the way over here for no reason. If you wanted to watch true elites, you should have gone to watch the gates with powers rather than this City Lord gate. It's rare for anything meaningful to come out of the cities. And those that are worth watching have already entered the city. Well, isn't that madman's sister down there? Maybe the genes run in the Kiefer family. The others looked at the young man who spoke like he was crazy. You know that madman is overprotective about anything related to his wife and his little sister. You better watch your mouth. I don't care if you die, but if I'm guilty by association, who will I go complain to? It was clear that these people were speaking about Syl's elder brother. It seemed that he had already entered the city. However, oddly enough, his wife and Syl's sister-in-law, Era, didn't seem to be a participant. It obviously wasn't because Era was too weak, and it obviously wasn't because she was too old. Whatever the true reason behind this seemed a bit complicated. Regardless, Lionel wasn't privy to this information as he couldn't even hear the conversation. Still, all those on the top of the city walls seemed to accept this person's word as law and they all closed their mouths. It's a shame though. Someone else picked up the conversation that had fallen to silence. The cities are only going to fall further and further behind the powers at this rate. If they don't get themselves together and see the bigger picture, they'll be left behind. The others sneered hearing this. It was clear they were all from powers themselves, or they wouldn't be reacting like this. It isn't their fault. Their structures are flawed from the beginning. Us powers are built on strength first and foremost while their foundations are economy and governance. To them, abandoning terrain would ruin their futures completely, whereas for us, wherever there's room for self-improvement, we'll be able to thrive. They only have themselves to blame for their collapse. The words these young masters spoke easily uncovered the dark underbelly of terrain without regard. Unlike the common people who had to tiptoe around their words, these nobles spoke their minds freely and boldly. This was the representation of true power. The group snickered. Oh, looks like someone is going to try? Huh. Is that boy really in the third dimension? They had been so lost in their own worlds that it was only now they noticed that the young man teaching Jirak his place was actually within the third dimension. For one, they had never heard of a person in the third dimension even making it through the pressure of the gates. Though the pressure was adjusted based on strength, there was still a minimum requirement for foundation. They had simply never seen someone within the third dimension meet these standards. And secondly, anyone who could make a fool out of Jirak should definitely be a monster. The only reason they hadn't paid more attention to Lionel before despite this was because the City Lord system was declining harshly. Though Jirak had some fame, they all docked him several points simply by virtue of this. Why would they care about someone who was only beating someone they didn't care much about to begin with? Would you care about the power of someone capable of stomping an ant to death? Bang! At that moment, Lionel's palm touched the tall doors, his robes and hair billowing. Jirak, who was already hardly able to stand on his own 2 feet, was blasted flying, rolling in the dirt until he slowly landed before the feet of the 2 women who were still a good distance from the gates. Lionel felt a force trying to rip his arm apart. Strong energies surged toward him, but they rebounded off his body like crossing blades, filling the air with the sound of harsh sharpening metal. Bang! The ground beneath Lionel's feet cracked slightly. Fine lines raced across, meeting together and separating just as quickly as they spread outward. Lionel closed his eyes. He could sense the 5 levels of the door. In fact, it wasn't much different from the scene he saw when unlocking his metal synergy lineage factor. Soldier, General, Royal, King, Emperor. The whole city quaked. Lionel thought of waiting for Jirak to go first again. But after seeing his poor performance, Lionel felt that it was beneath him to even need such a person to contrast himself with. He simply served no purpose. In that case, he would make it a one-man show. His singular palm rested the door. He could feel it pushing back against him, wanting to throw him away the very same way Jirak had been. Lionel's eyes shot open. Bronze runes raced across his body. a halo of bronze violet appearing above his head. Those with lineage factors suddenly felt their hearts tremble, their blood running in reverse. Open! Bang! The scene was one those watching would never forget. Chapter 358. Bang! Bang! The gates flew open. In those moments, it felt as though a tornado had formed around Lionel. On one side, wind rushed in violently, blowing everything away. On the other, an undefeatable suction surged, sweeping up everything in a rush of quicksand-like wind. However, nothing was as deafening as the sound of the gates smashing against the hallowed walls of Brave City. The reverberation was so resounding, so cacophonic, so tempestuous that the whole city quaked. At that moment, no matter what section of the city you were in, everyone looked toward the same direction, shock coloring their features. This commotion? What could it possibly be? Those that could see what was happening were shocked to the point of speechlessness. The crowd that had been spectating from half a kilometer away only saw Lionel place a single palm forward before doors that towered into the skies nearly flew off their hinges beneath his presence. In fact, the ground beneath their feet quaked endlessly, causing some weaker individuals to fall to their butts, unable to understand what they had just seen. Just what level of strength was this? Of course, these people had no idea that opening the doors wasn't a contest of strength. It was a contest of will and battle aura. However, to Lionel, who had already fully awakened the first level of his metal synergy lineage factor, it was nothing but a joke. In fact, Lionel even felt it was too easy. Soldier, general, royal, king and emperor? Lionel thought to himself, looking into the massive window toward the city he had created himself. Something seems to be missing. Lionel took a step forward, crossing the threshold. A wash of energy flooded toward him, coalescing into a golden brand between his brows. Compared to the runes that shone across his body, it was lacking in momentum and radiance. However, to those of Brave City, this golden mark was the highest entry honor of the city. The Emperor class. Lionel had no idea the level of commotion his actions would cause. Brave City was separated into tiers. Much like some parts of society, there were locations one could not enter without the appropriate credentials or standing. Within the city, these separating lines were even more exaggerated. The city itself isn't like how one would think it would be. Rather than being a metropolis, Brave City looked more like a war camp. There were no paved roads. Just like the outside of the city walls, the ground was covered in nothing but a brownish soil that looked like the land of a military practice ground. In every which direction, one could find monuments of stone called the Bravery Pillars. They depicted the exploits of soldiers and generals of the past, and were among the most important staples of Brave City. Rather than buildings, much of Brave City was an arrangement of tents, especially the outer city limits. Only royals were allowed to live in small hut-like structures while only emperors had stone housing for themselves. However, despite this seemingly organized structure, there was nothing peaceful about this city. Battles of all sorts seemed to take place every moment. Whether it was a battle for resources, for the monuments or even for housing, it seemed as though one would take place all the time. Outside of the seemingly territorial housing system, there didn't seem to be a single ounce of order throughout the whole city, except for in just one place. A singular tower stood in the very middle of the city. Aside from the walls of the city itself, it was the only structure that stood above 2 or 3 stories tall. In fact, it shot hundreds of meters into the air, much like the war-etched walls on the outside. From the top of this tower, one could overlook the whole city and all 8 of its gates. However, to be able to step to this floor, the minimum requirement was to be a king. For someone of such standing, they obviously wouldn't come here to overlook ants they thought to be beneath them. That said, there were exceptions to every rule. Just how much commotion would the swinging of doors hundreds of meters high cause? Just how much worse would this commotion be if the action was so violent that the doors hardly stopped even after slamming into the walls that held it up? Everyone knew that for the whole gate to open, it could only mean that a new emperor had appeared. However, even past emperors hadn't caused such a commotion, and most people could only hurriedly squeeze through a crack they caused in the gates. Who had ever heard of someone being given such a wide berth? At that moment, the usually bustling top tower floor fell into silence. Their eyes all landed on the same young man. Compared to the size of the doors, he seemed so small, like an ant that could be stamped into a meat paste at any moment. However, it was as though the doors didn't dare to close as he walked through. They stayed attached to the walls, still reverberating with residue of the previous impact that, even to this moment, resounded in everyone's ears like an endless echo. Who is that? They were all stunned to find out that none of them recognized the young man. Other than feeling some trembling in their hearts toward the odds runes drawn across his body, there was nothing else they could glean about him. It seemed that a variable had appeared. Within the tower, 3 familiar faces could be found. Well, they weren't quite familiar to Lionel. However, had Aina been there would be no doubt that she would recognize these people at first glance. Young heir of Cliff's Edge Terrace, Rain-Red Solar. Young heiress to World's End Falls, Jonia Falls. Young heir to Mirage Pavilion, Wheeless Mirage. These 4 people had no idea how they were connected, but it didn't seem to matter. Brave City would make them enemies regardless. At that moment, as though everyone had realized a singular threat before them, several auras locked onto Lionel. Chapter 359. Bang. A shadowy figure shot through the roof of an inn, causing brick and chips of wood to fly through the air. The shocked screams of the citizens rocked the small city, but the shadowy figure continued to leap from wall to wall and house to house, eventually landing atop the city walls. These walls couldn't compare to those of Brave City in the slightest. They were at most 10 meters tall and a few meters thick. This place was only considered a Tier 7 city that couldn't compare even to Swan, Black or Kiafur City. However, it was unique in that rather than being under the jurisdiction of a city lord power, it was beneath the power of World's End Falls. When the shadowy figure finally came to a stop, those that could see it shivered. The figure was completely covered in a black cloak, its back hunched up in a curved arc, making it difficult to tell just how someone with a body like this could possibly move so agilely. The figure held a massive greatsword in their hands that spanned the length of 3 meters. Even now, it glistened with the blood of several guards. At that moment, the city guards charged from all directions wearing white robes alternating in a sky blue soft armor. Sword monstress. The cloak covering the face of the sword monstress blew off, revealing the figure's features. It took but a moment for them all to recognize this scourge of terrain. She could only be described as a grotesque woman. She had a hunched back, her hair was unkempt and wild, and her face made the stomachs of all those who saw her crawl. They had long since lost count of the number of massacres this beast had been the cause of. She had wanted posters almost everywhere, yet she somehow managed to vanish whenever they seemed close to catching her. The sword monstress gaze looked particularly demonic. As though she had lost all sense of human reason, she all but growled in response. Without a word, she leapt forward, her monstrous sword being raised in her claw-like hands. The guard who had spoken found his vision splitting in two. Before he could even react, his consciousness faded, his body falling to the ground in 2 halves. The sword monstress body flashed, her sword drawing lines of crimson throughout the streets. Blood flowed to the stone-paved ground, seeping through the cracks and dyeing them red. Each life she reaped was only met by a violent gaze that only seemed to grow more and more bloodthirsty. It was as though it wasn't enough, as though she wanted more. At that moment, the head guard of the Tier 7 city had finally gotten word of what was happening, and began to rush over. The sword monstress, seemingly realizing the incoming danger, suddenly stopped her endless slaughter. She looked toward the distance, 2 sharp teeth shining through her heaving breath. Her body blurred, accelerating toward the distance. She leapt over the city wall as though it didn't exist, vanishing toward the wilderness before the head guard could long onto her. By the time the head guard appeared amidst the carnage, she had already long since left, leaving him standing there with a chest filled with rage and nothing to vent it on. Inform the higher-ups that she's escaped the encirclement by unknown means. Her next destination is unknown. The head guard clenched his fists. He already knew that his punishment for this wouldn't be small, but it was simply too difficult to lock onto a single target who hadn't been branded. With everyone headed toward Brave City, the in and out flux of tourists and citizens was too high. This was likely the worst time to be trying to catch a criminal. Lionel walked into the city. He swept his gaze over everything once before heading in deeper. Era hadn't told him much about the city and how things worked. All he knew was that entering was a test, and the better he performed, the greater benefits there was. Other than this, he also knew that when he chose an abode to stay in, he had to stay in this eastern section of the city since he entered through the eastern section. This wasn't to say that it was impossible to travel to other sections, but rather that it was seen as an act of war that could spark something he currently didn't have the means to deal with. Lionel, though, had his own reasons for being eager to enter the city. It wasn't just about making his name known so he could find Aina easier. It was also about finding a safe place to break through. Lionel felt like Brave City was the best place he could ever find to break through with his soul force. In fact, Lionel knew that he had no choice but to do this. If he didn't, he would have no way of dealing with the trials to come in the future. After claiming a home, you could receive a half-day's protection. But after that, Lionel knew that trouble would come knocking at his door. In truth, even if he broke through, Lionel wasn't quite confident in protecting himself. All of the spells he had, even the most powerful 3-star Magus arts, were still mere third-dimensional spells. Lionel didn't know how useful they would be against fourth-dimensional existences. Knowing this, rather than going off to quickly find a house to claim, Lionel waited for Syl. He felt that this city would most definitely have opportunities for him to take advantage of. He would take his time to find them before taking advantage of the 12-hour protection he would receive. This was of course the best plan. Lionel's thoughts were meticulous and well thought out. It was just a shame that trouble would find him before he could act on it completely. Those youths that had just been standing atop the wall recovered from their shock and stabilized their feet, having almost fallen from the wall thanks to Lionel's entry. After sending a glance toward each other, one after another, they descended the walls. Soon, they stood on level ground along with Lionel as the heavy gates slammed shut. Bang! Chapter 360. Lionel swept a glance toward the group before him. Though there were just 4 of them, each had the marks of royals on their foreheads. Lionel still wasn't exactly sure what this system of ranking meant, but just by virtue of this he was aware of why these 4 had come. However, he wasn't worried. These 4 didn't have any ability to take his mark of an emperor until he chose a home, and had held it in his possession for 12 hours. Since he hadn't even chosen a home yet, it was impossible for them to do so. That said, that didn't mean they couldn't act without reward, likely in an attempt to get him to hand over the mark himself. The 4 young men and women looked Lionel up and down with curiosity. "Who are you?" one of them suddenly asked. The speaker wore red robes matched with violet soft armor. Had Lionel been well informed, he would know that this young man came from Mirage Pavilion. However, considering his ignorance, other than noticing the well-matched colors, he didn't really think anything more of it. Lionel smiled carefreely. "My name is Lionel Morales." In Lionel's opinion, the more people who knew his name, the better. He didn't care about what tone the speaker was using, even if he was quite condescending. All that mattered to Lionel was that more people knew his name. The happenings of terrain meant little to him, and he also didn't particularly care about what this brave city represented, and the reason so many youths had come to this place. All he cared about was making his way back to Earth after finding Aina. If Lionel were to say what his goals were aside from finding her, it would only be destroying the Royal Blue Fort and helping Aina get revenge. Though he didn't know the full extent of Aina's backstory, knowing that the Brazinger family had wronged her was enough for him. Seeing Lionel's bright smile, the 4 were caught off guard. They had fully expected Lionel to lash out or even ignore them, giving them ample reason to stomp all over his pride. Though they asked who Lionel was, they already knew that he was a member of the Kiefer family. To them, other than Syl's elder brother, there was no one else worth fearing from this family. Even if Lionel was a bit more talented than their usual selections, so what? He was still within the 3rd dimension. Even the weakest individual knew how impossible it was to cross the dimensional barrier to battle, let alone doing so against 4 people. As far as they were concerned, Lionel was finished. However, as the saying went, it was hard to punch a smiling face. At that moment, the large doors were opened once again. However, this time, instead of the whole gate moving, it was simply one of the inner gates. And instead of it almost flying from its hinges as it had done just moments ago, barely a crack was formed for a tall, black-armored figure to squeeze through in a sorry state. It could only be said that the harsh reality of comparing yourself to another was too heart-wrenching. Jirak practically collapsed to the ground, heaving out such heavy breaths that it seemed he might cough up his lung at any moment. He placed his hands on his knees to keep himself from lying flat on the dusty roads. Unfortunately, he huffed up a big mouthful of kicked-up dirt, causing him to cough violently. He couldn't have been in a sorrier state, causing the four youths to snicker. When Jirak heard this, he looked up, his eyes reddening. "Who the fuck are you? You dare to laugh at me?" The youths wanted to laugh again, but Jirak suddenly vanished, appearing amidst the group and sending out a fist. The air shook beneath his strength, folding in on itself and layering his fists in a quaking wind. Lionel's lip twitched as he watched this. What kind of man with a wind affinity this high wears heavy army like that? At first glance he should be an earth affinity mage like me. Bang! The youth from the Mirage Pavilion was sent flying. Lionel could tell with a single glance that his jaw was snapped from its hinges. It was clear that whatever meals this youth would be having over the next few weeks would have to be through a straw. Who else? Who else was laughing it up? Come on, tell me. Where's the joke? I want to laugh too. It was impossible for anyone to tell that these four youths had just been standing atop the walls of the city, commenting on how weak Jirak was. Lionel watched in silence, a slight smile tugging at the corner of his lip. This Jirak was an interesting character. Jirak's fist slammed into the second male, sending him tumbling toward the first. They piled atop of one another, groaning and without the strength to stand. "Get a room, you bunch of perverts." Jirak growled before looking toward the two women. "I don't hit girls." Before the two women could sigh a breath of relief, Jirak continued. "Smack each other until I'm satisfied." The two women looked at one another, then back at Jirak, as though they were ready to fight to the death. But upon seeing Jirak rubbing his fists, their hearts trembled and they turned toward one another, each trying to get the first hit in. Jirak clapped, a wide grin spreading across his face. He brought his fingers to his mouth, whistling as though he was encouraging them to go on. "Go on, fight harder." "Yeah, just like that." "Hey, I bet she won't be able to fight as hard if you rip her clothes." "Whistle, what a show. What delicate skin. Oh, I think I see a little pink. Top tier, top tier." Jirak took out some herb coins and started flicking them toward the two fighting girls. He looked like he was having the time of his life. Lionel stood to the side, speechless. Chapter 361. Just when Jirak was getting into his groove, the gates opened once again, and this time, two women entered. Of course, they were Syl and young Miss Swan. When the two women saw the scene before them, they charged toward Jirak like a twin pair of lionesses. In fact, they even sent glaring daggers toward Lionel for not stepping in to stop this madman earlier. Toward such a thing, Lionel only chuckled and didn't say much. He was going to step in previously, but since they were here now, he didn't have to do anything. All right. Since these two she-devils have stepped in for you, leave your panties behind, and we can call it even." The two women shivered in terror hearing these words. "Jirak." Syl snapped. All right. Forget it. Jirak shook his head as though it was truly a pity. Looking quite pitiable, the two women helped their two friends up and they stumbled away. It was only now they noticed that Jirak actually had a king mark on his forehead. It seemed that they had been so distracted by how terrible he looked before that they had forgotten to account for this. It was only after this that Jirak suddenly looked toward Lionel seriously. "Do what you will." Jirak closed his eyes, crossing his arms across his chest and lifting his neck as though waiting for a blade to run across it. The little mink atop Lionel's head yawned lazily before sticking out its tongue as though to make fun of Jirak. It got bored of this quite quickly though, and went back to its nap. Lionel could tell that the little guy was growing more languid lately. The little mink he knew was always lively and looking to play. Lionel wasn't sure if this change was it maturing or if there was another reason. That aside, Lionel wasn't thinking much about this right now. He was only quite surprised that Jirac actually seemed to be waiting for death. Of course, Lionel had never really expected to kill him in the first place. For one, he wasn't a bloodthirsty person, and he didn't enjoy to kill unless it was absolutely necessary. And secondly, he had only been saying the most boisterous things he could say for the sake of making sure his story spread as widely as possible. Lionel suddenly smiled. So your life is mine, right? Jirac opened his eyes and frowned. But in the end, yes. Good. Lionel's smile widened. Follow me then. I also don't know enough about this place, so tell me about it. Jirac raised his brows, unclenching fists he hadn't known he had clenched. Isn't Sil your fiancée? She didn't tell you anything about this? Lionel made a weird face. Fiancée? No, she isn't. Sil suddenly flushed as red as a tomato. Do you believe I won't rip your tongue out, Jirac? Jirac blinked. So she's single? Jirac. Young Miss Swan giggled from the sidelines, seemingly enjoying this quite a bit. After a while, her eyes sparkled when she looked toward Lionel. So he's single too. Lionel, however, was no longer paying attention to their antics. His gaze seemed to cut through space, landing on a tower in the distance. From there, he could feel numerous gazes on him, all of which seemed to be waiting for something. Lionel felt his blood surging. Who knew how long it would take him to realize that his actions over the past few hours weren't as much of an act as he thought it was? You're saying no one knows where Brave City came from? Lionel looked toward Jirac, Sil and Kyra with a weird expression. Of course, Kyra was the first name of young Miss Swan. After listening to the banter between the two women, Lionel finally managed to learn this much. Well, Jirac mumbled. There are some theories, but, well, the truth is that as a fourth-dimensional world, we don't have high enough standing to confirm or deny this. We only have a few rumors. Lionel could see the discomfort the three felt when Jirac said these words. It seemed that this wasn't something that was acknowledged often. But in the grand scheme, it was nonetheless true that a fourth-dimensional world wasn't worth mentioning. It made Lionel realize that as small as terrain was, Earth was even more so. What rumors? Lionel asked. Jirac hesitated as though he wasn't sure whether or not he should say. But maybe because he remembered Lionel owned his life now, he realized he had no choice. They say that brave cities only appear in worlds that are at a crossroad. Lionel frowned. What was that supposed to mean? A crossroad? What kind of crossroad? One where we either develop ourselves or choose to abandon everything our ancestors built. Lionel still wasn't sure if he understood what this meant, but seeing as the three were only growing more uncomfortable, he shifted his focus slightly. Then what does a brave city get out of appearing? Is it like a subdimensional zone? Not exactly. Zones are created by the dimensional verse. But brave cities are built by people. As for what they get out of it, they say it's recruitment. Lionel's brow raised. A world at a crossroad, built by people. It's all for recruitment? Lionel couldn't help but think of the Star and Cross organization. Even to this point, he still didn't know their true name. All he had was a gut feeling that their scope was beyond that of just terrain, and that their uniforms were cool. There was nothing else. But who knew that even before he could understand who they were, another mysterious organization would appear? In fact, this one's method seemed even more shocking than the first. The Star and Cross organization was still tangible to Lionel. He could see them, interact with them, and unfortunately, be shamed by them. But this brave city organization had no face or image. And they somehow managed to make a city manifest from thin air, without even the strongest powers of this world understanding how. For the first time, Lionel was starting to get an understanding that this new world order was anything but peaceful. Chapter 362. Lionel stood at the base of a large stone monument. Just looking at it, it exuded the same type of aura the city gates had. It was just that this aura was displayed on a much smaller scale. Rather than enveloping an area of half a kilometer, this aura acted on just the 10-meter radius of the monument. However, from what Lionel could tell, this aura was actually several times that of the gates, as though it had been concentrated in place. Many people who stood around the monument curiously observed the new group of 4. When they saw that it was made of 3 kings and an emperor, they grew shocked and began to whisper amongst each other. In this sort of place, information was the greatest strength. The fact that they didn't know that these people were among the kings and emperors meant that they could only be new. Lionel. Syl said hesitantly. We still need to go report to my elder brother. Lionel frowned. Report? He felt a strong feeling against doing something like this. There was no telling what kind of personality Syl's elder brother had, or how he would react to Lionel's sudden appearance. Later. Lionel nodded non-committedly. Syl bit her lip, ignoring Kyra's amused gaze. This damned vixen. Is it necessary to stand so close to him? Still, Lionel didn't seem to notice the squabble between these 2 women, nor did he seem to realize that Syl's invitation was more about getting him away from young Miss Swan than anything else. But whether he acknowledged it or not didn't matter much. He already had his own plan in mind. Explain these monuments to me one more time, Jirak. Jirak grumbled. Was he really nothing but a glorified dictionary? He had no idea that this really was the case. Lionel didn't want to expose the true capabilities of the dictionary, so he continued to use it only as a translation tool. He didn't feel like falling out with another organization that lusted after his treasures. All these monuments depict moments in history. There's nothing special about them other than the fact cultivation is a bit faster if you can withstand their aura. You can see it for yourself. It's just telling the tale of some dead general. Lionel nodded. Maybe it was because this brave city wasn't native to terrain, but the words on this monument could be understood by Lionel even without using the dictionary's help. Gained victory after 121 days of battle. Mounted the head of. The more Lionel read, the more useless the information seemed to become. It was almost like a newspaper article. All of the most important facts about the topic were found in the header and the first few paragraphs. As it continued, it got useless to the point of even describing what General Farron had for breakfast that morning. It was no wonder Jirak had said this monument was useless. Lionel had no interest in how many women a general bedded in celebration of his victory. However, no matter how Lionel looked at it, he didn't think that these monuments were so simple because he felt danger from them. His primitive senses made him feel as though if he played around with these monuments too long he could die. The weird part about this feeling was that, obviously, no had died at the hands of this monument before. Had someone died, there was no way everyone here would be so casual about it. In fact, the only slight conflict here was in deciding who was allowed to enter the 10-meter radius of the monument. Of course, danger didn't necessarily mean that this monument would be avoided. After all, with danger came opportunities. But Jirak would have definitely mentioned it had such a danger existed. Lionel suddenly closed his eyes. A massive spherical force art was reflected in his mind. At that moment, his aura completely changed as though he had become one with nature. Even though he was standing right next to Kyra, Syl and Jirak, it was as though he was in an entirely different world. When he opened his eyes again and read the first line again, a shocking change occurred. Before Lionel could continue, his vision was enveloped in blackness. When his vision returned, what he saw was no longer a monument. He saw a man wearing a fiery red armor. He sat upon a tall crimson steed, and held a halberd that was just as blood-red. The aura he exuded was so suffocating that Lionel nearly fell to his knees. At that moment, the man riding the crimson steed stood at the helm of a massive army. He was leading so many men that from afar, they looked like millions of little ants arranged into neat square formations. Yet, despite the number of men, this man stood valiantly, his presence alone subduing the whole of the army. The man leveled his halberd with the ground, his chest growing out a size as he took a deep breath. The moment he released his breath, a mighty roar that shook the skies bore itself into Lionel's heart. Bang! Lionel was sent flying. Blood leaked from his nose and ears, his body skidding along the dirt roads. A violent force tore through his mind, looking to tear his ethereal glabella to shreds. It was as though this force wanted to erase any memories Lionel might have just gained. Lionel. Jirac and the two women were shocked, not knowing what happened. They all looked around with frantic gazes as though trying to find who sneak attacked Lionel. That seemed to be the only explanation for what just happened. Unable to find a thing, they could only rush to his side. But Lionel was out cold, blood continuing to flow from his orifices as a violent energy continued to rampage through his mind. Chapter 363. Lionel. Lionel. No matter how they shouted Lionel's name, it didn't seem to matter in the slightest. The one who attacked him must have wanted him dead. There was no other explanation. The appearance of a third-dimensional emperor was too conspicuous. The number who wanted to take advantage of Lionel's weakness was likely not few. It was simply too easy for those fourth-dimensional monsters to kill Lionel secretly, without any of them being any wiser. It couldn't be said that these three would live and die with Lionel. How could they? They had only just met. Jirac was practically Lionel's slave now, while the two women only had a small bit of budding feelings. It wasn't to the point of risking their lives. Yet, all three of them still uncontrollably ran to Lionel's side when they saw his current state. It was clear they all had a good impression of him. The little mink scrambled from Lionel's head, landing on his face and nudging him continuously. The energy continued to rampage throughout Lionel's mind. But it seemed to notice that it couldn't shatter the barriers of Lionel's ethereal glabella after a few attempts. How could it? After awakening his wisdom branch, Lionel's mind had already become capable of housing fifth-dimensional soul force. Even though he had yet to come in contact with fifth-dimensional force, it didn't change this fact. When comparing the sturdiness of one's ethereal glabella, Lionel was unmatched on terrain and earth. Seemingly realizing this, the energy changed its target, aiming for the embryos that hung vulnerably within the hidden world. By now, Lionel had already formed many embryos. A transparent spear stood for his spear embryo. A 12-pointed star silently whirred for his snowy star owl lineage factor. A bronze-violet halo represented his metal synergy lineage factor. Among them, the one that took up the most space was a bow. Harsh and violent cold winds surged around it, making it difficult even to approach. It seemed ready to tear anything that did apart. It was this group that the energy surged toward, ready to tear it apart. Without hesitation, it targeted Lionel's 12-pointed star first. It could sense that its healing characteristic could become a problem should it be allowed to continue. So, how could it not target it first? But it was at the very moment it made contact that things suddenly changed. A hidden scarlet energy was stirred. It had hidden itself deeply within the 12-pointed star. No, it was more accurate to say that they had completely fused. The instant the energy came into contact with this scarlet force, it collapsed. There was no suspense, no hard-fought battle, no teetering on the edge of life and death. Just like that, it was snuffed out. The moment this energy was destroyed, Lionel's eyes shot open, his heart beating heavily as though trying to escape his chest. He sat up, catching Little Black Star before he fell to the ground. Lionel smiled, a sight that looked a bit gruesome considering the blood running down his nose and ears. "It's all right, I'm fine. Lionel comforted the little mink. Lionel wiped the blood from his face with an arm, looking back toward the monument. His gaze narrowed. He realized something. All this time, he had been subconsciously restraining his internal sight. But when he meditated on the natural force art, in order to appear within his dream world and the real world at the same time, the only option was to use his internal sight. Lionel had learned from Uncle Montez that wantonly using his internal sight was seen as a taboo in this new world order. So he had always been careful with doing so. This made him miss the fact that his internal sight was severely restricted beneath the aura of this monument. It wasn't that there was nothing to gain from this monument, but rather that anything worth gaining could only be seen through internal sight. It wasn't even necessary for Lionel to use the natural force art to see it. In fact, the fact Lionel used the natural force art caused him to dive too deeply into the world, which was what caused such an exaggerated backlash. Had he dipped his toes in more slowly, He wouldn't have suffered nearly as badly even if he did a bit. Coming to this realization, Lionel understood the crux of the matter. In this world, without internal sight, it was impossible to cultivate. Due to this, it was both a point of emphasis and something that was easily glossed over. These youths standing around the monument might have already tried to examine it with their internal sight, but because theirs was so much weaker than Lionel's, it wasn't even possible for them to cut through the pressure and touch the monument with their senses. Their only option would be to walk through the pressure personally. However, the pressure here was many times that of the gates. Most couldn't even enter a 5-meter radius, let alone get close enough to extend their internal sight. This made Lionel certain that there were very few in this brave city who had succeeded in doing what he had. And these people, in all likelihood, had kept this secret to themselves. Lionel. Lionel was suddenly awakened from his thoughts only to find that 3 people were standing above him. These 3 were, of course, Jirak, Kyra and Sil. They looked over him with a mixture of confusion and worry. Who attacked you? Jirak was the first to ask. Oh, I'm not sure. Lionel shrugged. It was probably just a warning, or else I'd probably be dead. Seeing Lionel's nonchalant response, the 3 didn't know how to respond. Was this a way that someone who had just died was supposed to react? Lionel, however, was already thinking of other things. This monument wasn't suitable for him. It was too bloodthirsty, and also the general it depicted used a halberd. In truth, the halberd and spear had many similarities, but Lionel had the spear domain to learn everything he needed about the spear. He didn't need outside resources. He needed to visit the other monuments, and hopefully find something that would make his breakthrough into the 4th dimension with his soul force allow him to protect himself. Lionel was mostly hoping to find a 4th-dimensional mage. If he couldn't find it within the eastern section of the city, he would have to travel to the other sections even if it meant starting a war. Jirak, Sil and Kyra obviously had no idea what Lionel was thinking otherwise, who knew how they'd react to this madman. Chapter 364. As much as Lionel wanted to ignore everything else around him and focus on the monuments, there was only so long he could dodge Sil. Not long after Lionel found out the truth about the monuments, and was planning on traveling through them one by one, the remaining 7 members of the Kiefer family's selections finally made it through the gates. Aside from the petite girl who had confronted Lionel initially who became a royal, the rest were either generals or soldiers. With all of them now here, Lionel couldn't continue to stall Sil, and had no choice but to follow her through the eastern sector, and into the more luxurious regions. Jirak, why are you following us? Sil said, seemingly a bit displeased. Apparently, she still hadn't forgotten about the words Jirak had said to take advantage of her earlier. Wherever Lionel goes, I go. Jirak said matter-of-factly. Lionel didn't refute this. If things went south, Jirak was maybe the only protection he had. He was under no delusions that he would be able to handle Sil's elder brother on his own. Unless Era had a way to contact her husband, it was unlikely that the Kiefer family heir was even aware of Lionel's existence. And Lionel had a bad feeling that Era wanted it this way. Lionel wasn't oblivious. He knew of the underhanded tricks Era was pulling behind the scenes. One of the things he was best at was reading people. And he wasn't new to women being fond of him. As a 5-star quarterback, there were plenty of women, even those from noble families, who were willing to throw themselves at him. Even though the occupation wasn't as respected, that was only a matter of relativity. Not every woman would be able to find a husband from a 5-star profession of high standing. And as a quarterback, Lionel was guaranteed to become a very rich man in the future. This was all to say that Lionel could easily read the signs of women coming on to him. It was just easier to pretend to be ignorant. But by now, Lionel realized that if he allowed things to continue like this without stepping in properly, a small misunderstanding could easily become a massive one. The worst part was that he couldn't just step out and say he had feelings for another woman. He was quite familiar with women, and saying such a thing bluntly would only make him public enemy number 1. Please come back soon. Lionel looked up into the sky, holding back crocodile tears. Things would be so much easier if Aina was here, even if she was still pretending to not like him. Lionel suddenly smiled. That's all right, I know you've already fallen for me. Syl and Jirac looked toward Lionel's suddenly smiling face, wondering just what he was thinking about. At that moment, the surroundings began to change. From dirt roads and tents, they began to see neat little huts amid smooth roads. Soon, those smooth roads became paved in stone and the huts became small houses of brick. Even now, one couldn't say these homes were luxurious. They were quite minimalistic compared to true behemoths one might find in the outside world. However, in this place, where the only building taller than 3 stories was the massive tower that connected the sectors, this was by far the best place to live. Each home was gated and had a different style, exuding a different aura. Some reminded Lionel of gentle winds, others of rushing water, and still others like raging flames. However, what each house had in common was a single lamppost before its gate. It only took a moment for Lionel to understand that if this lamppost was lit, the house had been claimed. If it hadn't been, then the lamppost wouldn't be. Judging by the current situation, there were much more homes lit than Lionel thought there would be. Were there really this many emperors? Syl hesitated for a moment. Though she knew her brother would be here, she wasn't exactly sure where he would be. You don't want to choose a house? Jirac suddenly asked, glancing toward Lionel. Not yet. Lionel shook his head. Jirac laughed. If I was as weak as you, I'd be hesitant too. Lionel chuckled in response, not minding. How'd it feel to lose to someone so weak? Syl giggled, forgetting about her task to find her brother for a moment. Just as the group was about to continue through to see if they could find any clues, Lionel frowned. He turned back to find a young man strolling through the stone-paved roads. He wore white robes that shifted slightly with his every step. His long, black hair was neatly tied, making it almost impossible to make out individual strands. Everything about him exuded an air of refinement and cleanliness, almost like a diligently polished blade ready to be unsheathed. Syl noticed Lionel's odd reaction and turned back. Her eyes lit up in pleasant surprise. Big brother. Lionel's gaze narrowed. He hadn't expected to run into this man so easily. And most importantly, he hadn't expected that even after overestimating his potential abilities in his mind, that Lionel would still be so surprised by the pressure he felt from this young man. As Lionel was looking toward the Kiefer family heir, he too was looking toward Lionel. The young heir had never met Lionel before. He didn't know who he was either, but he still felt his eyes gravitate toward him. And when he noticed the emperor mark that barely shrouded the black brand between his brows, he felt inwardly surprised. For a moment he forgot to respond to his sister. A sword that hung to his back vibrated slightly, making it seem as though the blade might unsheath at any moment. This was the first time Lionel noticed the sword. His vision had been so focused on the young man before him. However, after a moment he realized why he hadn't. The sword wasn't attached to anything. It floated in the air, following the young man around as though it couldn't bear to part with him. Lionel couldn't imagine the level of skill that was needed to reach such a state. Chapter 365. The atmosphere grew silent. Syl seemed to realize that something was wrong when she saw her brother and Lionel staring down one another. But any words she wanted to speak seemed completely caught in her throat. She felt that she couldn't form the things she wanted to say no matter how hard tried. Shing, shing, shing. The sword to the young heir's back continued to tremble. Some unknown force held it back from unsheathing. Lionel continued to silently watch, sizing up the young man in white before him. Lionel knew too little about the fourth dimension to accurately gauge strength, but he could sense pressure easier than maybe anyone else. Even though this young heir was weaker than Uncle Zimo, considering his youth, Lionel had no doubt that there would come a day when Zimo was completely overshadowed. Suddenly, the pressure dispersed. The young heir looked from Lionel to his little sister and smiled lightly. Though the smile was a bit cold, it was filled with a doting air to it. "Syl, you're here." The young man nodded. "And who is this?" Syl shook her head to recover. Sister-in-law recommended him. He's participating as one of us. His name is Lionel Morales. Morales? The young man frowned. He felt something stir within him as his thoughts drifted toward a certain memory. But he didn't remain in a trance for long. The universe was too big. Those sharing the same name were far too numerous. Of course, those who were on the same level as certain families wouldn't dare to share the same name. For example, there was no way someone on Terrain would take the Kiefer family name. Such a person would be asking for death. However, there might very well be other fourth-dimensional worlds where the Kiefer name was used. The influence of the Kiefer family wasn't large enough to instill that kind of fear. This was all to say that it was a matter of perspective. And, to put this matter into perspective, the fact that this young heir even paused at this name meant that his scope was already far beyond those usually found on the fourth-dimensional plane. A higher-dimensional world wouldn't care what ants beneath them did. But the young heir knew that if by some miracle this Lionel Morales really made it to such a height, he would definitely have to change his name, unless he wanted to be hunted down and executed. This matter was definitely not as rare as it seemed, and no small number of stubborn individuals had suffered. However, the young heir didn't bother to tell all of this to Lionel. Such a thing was far too distant in the future, and the likelihood that Lionel would ever reach such a level was slim to none. The young heir nodded. So Era decided this. The young heir was quite familiar with his wife, so he had a good idea of what she was thinking. But taking care of someone in the third dimension, no matter how talented they were, would be difficult. Even he didn't dare to enter Brave City until he had grown to a certain level of strength. Is there a reason the Black City heir is here? Syl's elder brother asked. Jirak snorted. The only difference between me and you is that you're a bit older. Is there a need to stick your nose so high into the sky? Still, even the usually boisterous Jirak didn't dare to say these words aloud. Though this young heir seemed refined, anyone who had heard of history knew that he was a madman. He's with me. Lionel replied, seemingly noticing Jirak's apprehension. Oh, the young heir didn't ask anything further. The situation right now is a bit delicate. The trials will begin in another month, but that doesn't mean the city is safe. In fact, this is maybe the most dangerous time. There's a good chance that a territorial war could be sparked. Lionel scratched his nose, pretending as though he didn't plan on being responsible for starting one. Be sure to stay within the limits of the eastern sector. And if you are going to the central tower, travel in pairs. Also, be cautious of the monuments. Lionel's eyes narrowed when he heard this, but didn't say anything more, waiting for the young heir to finish his spiel. After a while, Lionel suddenly got curious about something. What benefits are there to a territorial war? There's got to be a reason for them, right? The young heir swept a glance over Lionel. Not many dared to cut him off while he was speaking like this. Of course, that was just the young heir's illusion. Lionel had waited for a slight pause in his long-winded admonishment. It was clear that the young heir was lecturing his little sister rather than speaking for all of their benefits, so Lionel asked a question instead. There are 8 sectors to the city. Each has their own residential area and monuments. The only way to access the other sectors is through the central tower. However, due to this, it also makes it very obvious when someone is crossing over to a sector they shouldn't be in. When you enter another sector, it becomes easier to upgrade your rank. Meditating before the monuments becomes easier, and the benefits for stealing abodes is also greater. Benefits of abodes. Lionel's gaze sparkled. Yes, every abode makes it easier to cultivate a specific special force. The short of it is that all benefits are greater when stealing them from another sector. But for this reason, people are also very territorial. Considering your strength, acting on this would only lead to your death. The young heir's words were quite pointed, but Lionel didn't really care to respond directly to them. Lionel found this young heir to be quite odd. At first glance, he seemed stoic, cold and quiet, but he was actually quite long-winded. I have one more question. Lionel pressed. Are there really this many emperors? Lionel looked around at all the lit lampposts. It couldn't be that emperors were so cheap, right? Who said an emperor could only claim one house? Lionel's eyes widened. So this was how it was. Thanks for the help. Lionel said with a smile. I'll help out the Kiefer family if I can. I'll be going now. After finishing his duties, Lionel bid his farewells. His thoughts were filled with how to make his imprint as big as possible. If he wanted to be known, there was no better option than attacking other territories. However, Syl's brother wasn't wrong, he was too weak to do so now. He needed a few backup plans first. The young heir's gaze narrowed as he watched Lionel's back retreat, his sword trembling once again. Jirac followed along quickly, not knowing anything about the crazy thoughts going on in Lionel's head. Chapter 366. Hey. Jirac jogged to keep up with Lionel, his heavy armor causing the paved roads to quake. Lionel looked back and couldn't help but smile. You know, for someone with such a strong wind affinity, shouldn't you wear something lighter than this, Baldy? Who knows, your hair might grow back if you stop straining yourself so much. What do you know? Jirac snapped like a cat that had its tail stepped on. Clearly his baldness was a soft spot. It's precisely because I have a high wind affinity that I should take full advantage of it. Who else could wear such heavy armor and yet still be so fast? Lionel shook his head and didn't reply to these words. They sounded logical, but the truth was that Jiric's speed would never reach its full potential like that. Just from what Lionel could see alone, he would easily be 2 or 3 times faster if he took his armor off. On top of that, he would never be as sturdy as someone with an earth affinity either. So he was essentially becoming decent at many things in exchange for losing out at being excellent in one lane. In a world where your life was on the line at every turn, Lionel felt that this was a mistake. But he didn't press Jirac too much. He still needed a bodyguard after all. So who are you really? Jirac asked curiously, leveling out his steps with Lionel. I told you already, Lionel Morales. Lionel replied casually, looking toward the next monument. You know that's not what I mean. You use a translator, so you're obviously not from this world. I hear you came out of the same carriage as Syl, but you both deny being betrothed. You should probably hide that from that madman, by the way. If he finds out that something like that happened, he might kill you for defiling his little sister. Jirac rambled. I'm from Earth. Lionel finally responded as Jirac had a pause. Earth. Jiric's steps stopped. Lionel frowned, looking back toward Jirac. Is there a problem? No. Jirac shook his head. Lionel raised an eyebrow. Was there a need for such an exaggerated reaction? Terrain was just as bad a name as Earth, after all. It could be said that all their ancestors needed some better naming sense. Lionel wanted to say something about Jiric's weird reaction, but he realized that they had already made it to the first monument. On the way to the Emperor abodes, Lionel had already mentally marked the locations of a few monuments. Unfortunately, Lionel was so focused on the monuments before him, and how they could help him find Aina, that he had completely missed the complicated gaze Jirac looked toward his back with. After a full day, Lionel fell into his thoughts, organizing everything he had seen. The eastern sector had 33 monuments and Lionel had been to them all. However, there were only a minority of them that caught Lionel's attention at all. The first one was of a bowman. Unlike what Lionel had with his spear domain, he didn't have a set path to follow with his bow. However, it would be a shame to ignore his talent for marksmanship. The only issue was finding sources that could help him continuously increase his skill. Of all 33 monuments he had been to, only one of them depicted a bowman. Even now, Lionel could remember her valiant aura and golden armor. She looked like a goddess descended toward Earth. Just from the few scenes Lionel saw, he could tell that she could control the flow of a 10-kilometer radius just with her bow and arrows alone. It was a level of skill Lionel couldn't even imagine in his current state. The second monument that caught Lionel's attention was of another woman. The only unfortunate part was that she was a fire mage and not an earth or light mage. Lionel still remembered being entranced. This woman stood in the skies wearing a fiery red robe so long it extended tens of meters past her feet. Her fiery red hair was of an obscene length as well, whipping about like rays of crimson amidst the clouds. The domain that surrounded her seemed burnt to ash. The air was dry, the ground was black, the wind was scorched. It felt as though one was standing in a perpetual hell just being around her. Lionel remembered being in awe when he came out from the illusion before soon being disappointed. After all, he wasn't a fire mage. And even though he had dream sculpted all the mage arts of Camelot, regardless of element, he had never even so much as used a fire element spell before. However, that was when something shocking happened. Lionel realized that when he looked around him, Jirac and the others who had surrounded the monument at the time had separated their distance to him by a large margin. At first, Lionel had been confused, but when he looked around, he found that there was a radius of scorched ground around him. In fact, the only things not burnt to ash near him was the little mink napping on his head without any worries and luckily his clothes. It was then that Lionel came to realization. His Scarlet Star Force. Top 10 amongst Star Elemental Forces. Top 3 amongst Light Elemental Forces. And the very best amongst Fire Elemental Forces. Without realizing it, Lionel's affinity for fire magic had surpassed his affinity for both earth and light elemental magic. Whether it was his metal synergy or snowy star owl lineage factors, they were all overshadowed by his innate force node. This could only be expected. After all, a lineage factor is passed down and must be slowly unlocked, whereas an innate force node was all to a person's own. Of course, Lionel's Scarlet Star Force also vastly improved his light and star element affinity. Compared to others with light and star elemental affinity, Lionel was amongst the very top few now. However, even compared to that increase, his fire affinity still gained the greatest leap. Even though he couldn't use his innate force node to its full potential now, simply by virtue of having it, all flames in the world bowed down to him. Chapter 367. The third monument that caught Lionel's attention was actually a sword-wielding man. However, this wasn't because of the weapon. Lionel had no interest in switching from the spear. In fact, he found that he was growing more and more fond of the spear every day. There were two reasons this monument caught his attention. For one, Lionel recognized a part of its aura. When he thought about it, he realized that it was very similar to the aura he had sensed on Syl's elder brother. Of course, the aura on Syl's elder brother was far weaker than the one Lionel sensed from this monument. However, it was the same aura nonetheless. As the saying went, it was important to understand one's enemy. Though Syl's brother wasn't yet at such a point with Lionel had too much PTSD from organizations he joined betraying him. By this point, he was already on his guard and was preparing for the worst-case scenario. That said, if it was only about understanding Syl's elder brother, Lionel wouldn't be so interested in this monument. After all, no matter how much he understood the young heir, it was useless if he was too weak to do anything about it. Ultimately, what was most important was his own strength. However, there was a second matter that caught Lionel's attention. The sword-wielding man had a pair of wings. Lionel hadn't spent much time comprehending Golden Feather Step just yet, but he already understood just how important movement was in battle, especially if he was the weaker party. If one was far weaker in strength but had speed, there would always be a chance for survival. However, there were plenty of examples of stronger individuals suffering at the hands of those much faster than them. This was part of the reason Lionel didn't agree with Jaric's methods. Speed kills. What was exceptionally beautiful about this monument was that this winged swordsman placed emphasis on his speed. His movements and swords were fluid, moving together as one. The flaps of his weapon and the swings of his sword almost looked like breathing. The contraction of the diaphragm, the expansion of the lungs, the suction of air, the relaxing of the diaphragm, the shrinking of the lungs, the expelling of air. In a continuous cycle, they flowed into one another, nurturing one another, strengthening one another. Even compared to the other monuments Lionel had lost himself in, he spent an exceptionally long time at this one despite the fact he was only trying to hop from monument to monument as quickly as possible. It was thanks to this that Lionel realized something else his dreamscape battle sense was missing. He didn't have enough fluidity. Right now, his battle sense worked by sensing a change and reacting to it. But that was entirely reliant on his opponent doing something. What if Lionel ran into a patient opponent who shared a similar battle style? How would his battle sense react when it had no information to read? Unfortunately, Diane could only store such thoughts in the back of his mind. Even this most simple version of his battle sense used up so much stamina. He couldn't imagine what would happen if he tried to add fluidity. He couldn't even wrap his mind around how he would do this. Still, this matter of fluidity taught Lionel something most could only learn after experiencing countless battles. Movement wasn't just about evading and defense. It was just as important in attacking. Only when one's steps flowed with one's actions seamlessly would one reach true mastery of their movement. Lionel was exceptionally lucky to grasp this truth before he truly began to study Golden Feather Step. It might even have the time he would need to master this technique. These were the 3 monuments that had caught Lionel's attention. This was a good result. Unfortunately, there was bad news. After Lionel studied all the monuments, he realized that he had been mistaken. There were no hidden techniques to learn or grasp. This meant that there were no fourth-dimensional techniques Lionel could learn to help make use of his soul force. All the monuments seemed entirely focused on aura and feel, as though it was teaching the disposition a warrior of a certain type should have. However, there were no techniques to glean from them at all. Such a reality left Lionel sighing. There are important lessons to learn, but that's about it. Lionel shook his head. These things weren't as useless as he thought. For example, the core lesson of the winged swordsman would lay a foundation for him in movement techniques that would only exponentially multiply in the future. If Lionel was correct, there were lessons to be gained from the bowman, or bowwoman, rather, and the fire mage as well. The bowwoman likely taught about control, and the fire mage definitely touched upon the concept of a domain. Still, all of these things sounded nice, but now Lionel didn't have an obvious path toward improvement. Without matching techniques, breaking into the 4th dimension wouldn't create as great a boost to his strength as he would like. Lionel looked up to the sky and sighed. It seemed that things wouldn't be as easy as he thought. He needed to talk to the dictionary to arrange his thoughts. After a while, Lionel grit his teeth. He would have to risk it. The only place he would feel safe using the dictionary was in his own protected abode. He would have to put it all on the line and claim one now. If he let things stay as is, he would eventually suffer. Hesitancy and inaction were just as bad as failing miserably at times. Lionel could feel many eyes on him. Many had been watching his every action for a long time now, wondering how long he could hold out. When everyone saw him walking back toward the abode setting, numerous spies sent to monitor his actions rushed back toward their masters, cold lights flickering in their gazes. Jirak, who had followed Lionel all this time, frowned deeply. He couldn't help but look toward Lionel's side profile. Was he really going to do it now? Chapter 368. Lionel walked along the stone-paved roads once again, calmly observing the abodes and lampposts one by one. He was easily able to see which abodes could help with what. Most were focused on the main elements of fire, wind, earth and water. Aside from them, there were a few rarer kinds that fell into the category of variants. The best sort of abode for Lionel would be a star elemental abode. Only such a place would be highly compatible with him, and would make the process of evolving his soul force much smoother. Also, since he wasn't necessarily restricted to one abode, a metal variant of the earth element would also be greatly beneficial to him. This would help him improve his metal body at a much quicker rate. That said, this wasn't at the forefront of Lionel's mind. After all, he had long since realized that the aura beneath the gates and monuments could also work to greatly speed up the strengthening of his metal body. In fact, since the aura beneath the monuments were 10 times more concentrated, they were even better than the gates had been. Lionel continued to walk, quickly getting a bit worried. He saw some variant abodes, but he still hadn't seen a Star Force abode. What are you looking for? Jirak finally couldn't hold back. In his mind, after seeing how devastating Lionel's fire affinity was, Lionel should have long since chosen an abode. They had already passed by 2 fire elemental abodes, and 1 variant fire elemental abode. Of course, Jirak had no idea that Lionel had yet to consciously work on his fire affinity before. I'm looking for a Star Force abode. Lionel replied. There was no need to hide anything anyway, since once he found such an abode, practically everyone would know about it. Star Force. Jirac was shocked again. It was difficult to explain just how rare those with star affinity were. They were even on par with those that had enigmatic affinities like time and space. Star Force was the only force in existence that could be cultivated and used no matter the environment. There were many locations in the universe where energy of a certain kind became scarce and impossible to sense. Those who had such affinities that were unlucky enough to end up in such regions could only lament their bad luck and hope to survive. In such environments, even abilities could become useless. However, no matter where one was, there would always be star, space and time force. These three forces and the other rare ones like it all had this fundamental reason that set them apart. Suddenly, Jirac laughed. No wonder, no wonder. I thought you were a madman for a second, but it seemed you had a plan too. Lionel raised an eyebrow. What's that supposed to mean? You don't have to act ignorant anymore, I see through you. Lionel frowned in confusion. No, really. Jirac gave Lionel a weird look. You really don't know? Really? Madman. Just a madman. Jirac grumbled. Claiming an abode requires two prerequisites. The first is that you must have the appropriate rank. It's possible for an emperor to claim a king's house, but it isn't possible for a king to claim an emperor's unless they upgrade their mark. The second prerequisite is that the trial of the abode must be passed. Lionel's gaze suddenly brightened, his steps coming to a halt. You mean to say that the trial that must be passed is related to the affinity of the abode? So if I'm the only one with Star Force affinity, if you're the only one with Star Force affinity, then it would be impossible for anyone to claim your abode other than you unless they're seeking death. The trials are quite simple if you share the necessary affinity, and you can muddle your way through variant affinities as long as it's related to your main affinity. However, if you try to claim a home you have no affinity with, heavy injury is the best-case scenario. Lionel's gaze brightened like two torches. Was this what they called luck? Was he finally going to get something to go his way? Lionel was a virgin and hadn't even kissed a woman before. In fact, the only times he had even been able to touch Aina somewhat intimately was when she was either unconscious or half dead. But he could swear that being with a woman couldn't possibly feel half as good as he was feeling right now. He almost shed real tears. Jirac gave Lionel another odd look. Why does he look so happy? Why does his expression almost look lewd? Jirac almost began to shed his own tears. He could only hope that Lionel didn't use his control over his life to take his chastity. Of course, if others knew Jirac was thinking himself as chaste, he'd probably be stoned to death. After a moment of happiness, Lionel regained his composure. Even if these people couldn't try to seize his abode, the fact of the matter would be that he would still be unsafe when he left his abode. And he would have no choice but to leave it if he wanted to make his name known to find Aina. In addition, it wasn't like he could bring the monuments into his abode either. However, this was still the greatest news he had heard in a long while. Even if he would still be at risk, he wouldn't have to worry about the 12-hour limit anymore. In addition, should things go south, he had a safe house he could return to. Of course, this was as long as no one else had a star affinity. Soon Lionel and Jirac made it to the end of the stone-paved roads. For a moment, Lionel thought he had dropped back down to an abyss because even now, he couldn't find a star affinity abode. But that was when his gaze landed on 6 homes that sat side by side. In fact, they were a measure larger than all the other homes. One gave off a radiant gold light. The next pulsed with darkness. The third seemed warped, dilating one's sense of time. The fourth seemed to stand in a plane of its own. It looked as though it was right before them, yet hundreds of miles away at the same time. The fifth made Lionel exceptionally excited. It too exuded a light. But it was more gentle and dense than the first, not to mention warmer. This was definitely a star affinity abode. Finally, his heart rested easy. However, when he looked at the 6th house, Lionel's steps froze again as he fell into a daze. He felt as though he experienced his whole life once again. From the day he was born to this very moment right here. In his shock, Lionel saw the image of a woman gorgeous beyond words. It was the kind of beauty that seized the heart and overshadowed even young Mistress Era. She had eyes as bright as glistening emeralds, hair like a shimmering golden-white waterfall, and a smile that made tears uncontrollably fall from Lionel's eyes. She held a baby in her arms, her gaze a mixture of love and unwillingness. The image was so real that Lionel felt as though he was right there. He was the baby. He was the one being looked at in such a way. "Mom." Lionel had never said these words in his life. At least he had never said it to address another person. He never thought about his mother because he couldn't even remember her. He couldn't say he felt one way or another. But at this moment, he felt as though his heart was bleeding. How could he forget that gaze? When Lionel snapped out of it, he found himself standing in the same place staring at the same house. "Lionel. Oh, you're awake. Try not to stare at that abode too much. There've been stories of others never being able to extricate themselves. I've never heard of someone falling into a trance like you did coming out. You're very lucky." Lionel blinked, trying to regain his bearing. But the tears didn't seem to want to stop. "That abode, what is it?" Lionel forced out, his voice shockingly steady. "That." Jirac didn't even dare to look toward the abode as he referred to it. "They call it Dream Force." Chapter 369. The moment Lionel heard these words, he felt his mind tremble. After a moment, he wiped the tears from his eyes and shook his head. Lionel's personality was one that was difficult to grasp. It was hard to imagine that a person who seemed so soft-hearted as him wouldn't even spare a single thought toward his mother. It wasn't rare for children who grew up with one or no parents to have fanciful images of what could have been. Of course, some grew out of this phase while others never did. However, maybe very few were like Lionel, and never had such thoughts at all. This was maybe one of Lionel's true faces. Though he loved, he also had a deeply calculating side to him. When he told his former best friend James that he would leave Aina alone if she truly rejected him, he hadn't been lying. If the words no ever came out of her mouth or her actions ever made him feel as though she was rejecting him, he wouldn't hesitate to let that part of his heart die. Lionel knew this about himself. Maybe if it wasn't for the love he gained from his father, he could have very well become someone's cold-killing tool. There really wasn't much separating such a person from himself aside from his upbringing. To now, maybe Lionel had subconsciously accepted that his mother didn't want him, so he very logically cut off that part from himself. There was no need to waste time thinking about someone who had no need for him. However, the moment he saw that gaze, everything suddenly changed for Lionel. As logical and calculating as Lionel was, he was just as loving and caring. If the gaze his mother had for him was still the same, then no matter where she was, what trouble she was in, what was keeping her from his side, he would make sure to wipe it all out. It was that simple to Lionel. There was nothing more to think about. Jirac suddenly felt that suffocating aura once again. He could hardly move until Lionel finished going through his thoughts. "What is Dream Force?" Lionel suddenly asked, his heart growing calm. Lionel needed to know. Was it just coincidental? Or was there a reason behind everything? Jirac hesitated. The Dream Force abode was an extremely enigmatic existence. According to what Jirac knew, it didn't appear all of the time. It would often hide itself as though it was an illusion and rarely appeared. However, the times it did appear usually led to tragedy. There were no small number of geniuses who had lost themselves in an illusion just staring at it. It could be said that Jirac was lucky to not be one of them. He had been observing Lionel this whole time because he thought he was a madman. But then Lionel suddenly stopped and entered a daze. This luckily triggered some of Jirac's memories, so he didn't dare to look where Lionel was looking. But from what Jirac knew, it should have been impossible for Lionel to wake up. Yet, not only had Lionel woken up, he had only been in a daze for a few seconds at most. This left Jirac more shocked than almost anything else ever could. Could it be that all those legends were exaggerated? They must be. Despite thinking this, though, Jirac still didn't dare to look toward the sixth abode. It's another high-level force. Wherever there are people, there will be Dream Force. So, in a way, just like how Star Force is never restricted by location, so is Dream Force. After all, If you happen to find yourself in such a place, as long as you exist, there will be dream force. But what is it exactly? Lionel asked, his expression having regained an eerie calm. He almost seemed too placid. I don't know much about it. I only heard someone once describe dream force as the representation of consciousness. Lionel's gaze sharpened. Consciousness. How much effort had the scientists of Earth put into finding the source of human consciousness? It was the one thing that even hundreds of years of technological advancement still couldn't describe. Some believed that human consciousness was stored in a soul or spirit. Others believed that everything that represented consciousness could be found within the brain, and that we only couldn't describe it because we didn't understand the brain well enough. When Lionel entered this new world order, he sometimes had fleeting thoughts that maybe a soul did exist. He had seen so many fantastical powers in the past year that this was much easier to accept for him. Yet even now he had yet to find this so-called soul of his. One had to know that soul force was just a name. It didn't represent a spiritual form of Lionel. It was simply an extension of Lionel's senses, another form of energy. Nothing more, nothing less. This was the reason why even though Lionel knew his ethereal glabella inside and out, he had never run into anything like a soul in there. All one could find were his embryos and his stars. There was nothing else. But what Jirac was saying now was that this dream force represented such a thing. It left Lionel feeling. Well, he wasn't exactly sure how he was feeling at all. All Lionel knew was that this was the abode he would be choosing. He didn't even hesitate as he took a step toward it. Jirac panicked. Hey, what are you doing? Lionel smiled lightly. Choosing an abode, obviously. You're going in the wrong direction. The star abode is over there. Lionel smiled but didn't reply. Jirac knew well what he was doing. Whether it was dangerous or not, Lionel didn't care. He needed to know why his heart was thumping like this. It was the same feeling Lionel had felt when he chose Dimensional Cleanse. It was the same feeling he had when he chose Golden Feather Step. Yet, it was several times more potent than the feeling had ever been. Were those names he chose a coincidence? Dream World, Dream Sculpt, Dreamscape, Dream Clone. How much of it was a casual name he had given his abilities, and how much of it was something compelling him toward the right path? Lionel had always believed that his ability and his soul force was inextricably linked. But what if this wasn't entirely correct? What if he was missing something? Lionel took several more steps, ignoring Jirac's attempts to stop him. Eventually, the poor bald Jirac, scared for his own safety, didn't dare approach the house any closer. Though he could stop Lionel by force with his strength, he could see a look in Lionel's eye that made him not dare to do so. Then Lionel crossed the threshold no one else dared to. What he didn't know was that his actions would soon cause an uproar. Chapter 370. Lionel was suddenly bombarded by a surge of force. It was unlike anything he had ever experienced before. The force he was used to was hard to sense, but it was still tangible. Even someone with weak internal sight could feel it as long as the concentration was high enough. But this force, despite being maybe in the highest concentration Lionel had ever seen, still felt unreal. The harder Lionel tried to reach out to it, the more fluidly it slipped through his fingers. It was as though Lionel was on a different plane, observing it from afar. However, despite there being such a surge, Lionel didn't feel like his life was in danger at all. In fact, he continued to walk forward without suffering any setback at all. If it wasn't for the fact he was taking his time to sense the mysteriousness of this dream force, he would have already long since crossed this trial. Before Lionel even realized it, he had made it to the door of the dream force abode. His palm reached out, touching the dark oak of the door. A light clicking sound reached Lionel's ears as the door slowly swung open. At that moment, a shield of protection suddenly vibrated. The lamppost that manned the outside flickered before erupting into a blinding light that shot into the skies. The eyes of numerous elites swung in a single direction. They were all used to the signs of an abode being conquered by now. However, the signs had never been this exaggerated before. In the whole of Terrain's brave city, not a single one had ever claimed one of these special abodes. Lionel, however, had no idea that he had suddenly become the center of attention. He was entirely immersed in an all-new feeling. His body, despite standing on the ground, felt as though it was soaring into the clouds. When Lionel finally snapped out of his odd state, he was uncertain of how much time had passed. But he was no longer worried about a time limit. Compared to the Star Force abode, this Dream Force abode was even more secure. Whereas someone bold might try to force their way through the Star Force trial, Lionel didn't believe anyone would have the guts to do so with the Dream Force abode. Facing something tangible was always easier than facing the illusory. In this abode, it was possible to fall into an illusion without even realizing what happened. If it wasn't for Lionel's high affinity with Dream Force, he would have likely fallen into an endless cycle as well. So that's how it is. Lionel exhaled a long breath, looking around his new home for the next while. He couldn't help but smile. He hadn't had a place he could call home in more than a year now. He didn't know how long he would be in this brave city, but he definitely felt at home here. The whole abode was decorated in white and black. The two shades complemented and danced with one another across the home. It was warm and pleasing to the eye, leaving Lionel feeling content. For the first time, Lionel didn't feel the need to ask the dictionary what was happening with him. He understood that compared to his affinity for fire, light, star, or earth, his affinity for Dream Force existed on a completely different plane of its own. It was so high, in fact, that even without being consciously aware, he had still made use of it before. Whenever Lionel entered his dream world, whenever he used Dream Sculpt, whenever he formed a dream clone, every time, without fail, without Dream Force as a core, he would have failed. To use something so unconsciously, as though he was breathing, just what level of affinity was that? But now that Lionel knew what it was and could consciously put it into motion, whoosh! A violent torrent of force surged toward Lionel. He completely expelled all of his normal soul force. It was nothing but a hindrance to him, limiting his abilities and causing him to use more stamina to perform tasks that should have been as easy as breathing. To Lionel, Soul Force and Dream Force were like the lubricants and fuel to a well-running engine. Not only was Soul Force far lower in quality, when it combusted, it gave off countless impurities, making its efficiency horrid. Not everyone could do as Lionel was currently doing. Dream Force represented consciousness. Those with low affinity could easily lose themselves, forgetting what was real and what was not. Their memories would become so real that it would feel as though they were reliving them in real time. Their phobias would manifest and hold control of them. Even their loves would become larger than life, enveloping their very beings. The number of pitfalls there were to using Dream Force were endless. Only those innately born with a comprehension of this force could make use of it without losing themselves. And thanks to his ability, Lionel just so happened to be one of these people. The moment all of his soul force was purged, Lionel felt as though a shackle on his mind had been lifted. Dream Force began to compress within his ethereal glabella, wildly surging about. Lionel wasn't worried in the slightest. The Dream Force he was accepting now, no matter how high level of an energy it was still considered to be within the fourth dimension. With the strength of his mind, it was child's play to accept for him. Whoosh! The force around Lionel kicked up a tempest. Lionel's hair fluttered wildly, his heavy robes billowing. What sounded like shattering glass resounded in Lionel's ears. Lionel's eyes shot open, a bright light making his pale irises seem no dimmer than his mother's bright emerald gaze for a moment. Lionel felt that his mind had never been clearer. He saw the things in the world down to their most basic building blocks, seeing through the foundation, even the most complex things with just a single glance. With a flip of his palm, the dictionary appeared once again. The last time Lionel checked the level of his ability, it had just barely crossed into the bronze grade. Though this was still a fifth-dimensional ability, with the other limiters on Lionel's body, it hadn't been able to truly shine. But now, ping, subject, Lionel Morales, calculative mind, an ability capable of simplifying the complex. Evaluating power, ping, evolution stage, quasi-silver, that you're tuning in to the Lee May's Sword of Destiny YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.